The next 3 hours is your chance to participate in a discussion about the books written by the presidential nominees. Joining us are John K. Wilson, author of Barack Obama, This Improbable Quest, and Jonathan Karp, editor of all of John McCain's books.
John Wilson, when did you first meet Barack Obama?
I first met Barack Obama in the mid-1990s when I took a class at the University of Chicago Law School with him on race, racism, and the law. And at the time, I thought, you know, here's somebody who's very knowledgeable, very thoughtful, who listens well, who seems very sensible, and of course I never imagined he could possibly have a political career. And so I think he's somebody who's really surprised me and surprised a lot of people. No one, I think, has ever doubted his intelligence and his abilities, but politics is a very different sport from teaching law or being a thinker, and so it's really remarkable that he's been able to translate so much of, I think, his intelligence and his ideas into the political realm.
What was he like as a teacher?
Well, he was somebody who and other people have commented on this as well in various news reports about him as a teacher. He's somebody who's very willing to listen to people with different points of view. He wasn't an ideologue spouting his ideas at the front of the lectern. He was somebody who was trying to engage students in a conversation, to get them thinking, to get them to challenge their own ideas as well as his ideas.
And in fact, you've written a biography of Barack Obama, This Improbable Quest. Here's the cover of the book. Did he cooperate in your writing of this book?
Well, you didn't cooperate in the sense that I didn't do an interview with him, but it was not meant to be so much of a personal biography, because of course his own autobiographical books tell so much of his own story better than anyone else could. It was meant to be more of a political analysis of his past, of his record, as well as the political environment in which he acts, about this movement that he's created, what I call Generation Obama, of young people who are inspired by his message, as well as all of the attacks he gets from the media, from the right wing as well as the left wing.
Well, this would probably be a good time to explain what we're doing this month on In Depth. We're doing something a little different. We are looking at the books written by Barack Obama and John McCain and trying to see what we can glean from them to learn about their policies and their personalities. John Wilson is a biographer of Barack Obama, former student of his. He'll be our guest for the first hour and a half, and then Jonathan Karp, who's been John McCain's editor, will join us for the second to talk about John McCain's books. Both, and we're going to put the numbers up on the screen in just a minute if you want to participate in this conversation. Both senators, best-selling authors. Would Barack Obama's book, Dreams of My Father, when it was first released in 1995, I believe, how did it sell?
It sold moderately well, maybe 10 or 20,000 copies sold. Nothing extraordinary, nothing special. It really was only when he became a prominent national figure in 2004 after the Democratic National Convention that there was all of this interest in who he was and about his experiences.
And it was re-released then?
Yes, it was re-released, and the copy that's most commonly available has an added preface to the book that he wrote from the position now of being a kind of media star. And at the time, the book was very well reviewed. It was well thought of. It just didn't have a kind of mass appeal and a kind of celebrity figure that gets you on the bestseller list.
Dreams from My Father, The Audacity of Hope. Which, in your view, is the most important book to read if you only read one?
I think The Audacity of Hope is in some ways the book to read. Dreams from My Father is probably the better book, the more literary book, the better written book in many ways, and it reveals more about his early youth and sort of his guiding influences. So in terms of literary merit, Dreams from My Father is the better book. But I think The Audacity of Hope is noteworthy because in the genre of books written by politicians, it's a very, I think, very thoughtful and insightful book. It doesn't have all of the usual platitudes that you get from a lot of political books. And it's also noteworthy because he wrote it on his own, and that's something you don't usually see in a lot of political books, of somebody writing their own books. Usually it's with a co-author or a ghostwriter.
No co-author, no ghostwriter for these two books?
No, he wrote both of them on his own. I mean, of course, there are editors at the publishing houses who work with any author, but these were books that he wrote himself, and I think that, to me, of course, as a writer, that's a powerful statement that the best qualification for president is to be a writer. But other people don't necessarily have that attitude.
How would you describe his writing style? And you are a supporter of his.
Yes. And I think his writing style, well, it varies from the two books. Obviously, the Dreams from My Father is much more of a literary book. It's much more in the genre of the memoir. It's very personal, and it reveals how much he reveals about himself. He reveals lots of things that, you know, a potential politician would not want to reveal about drug use, about the problems of his and the flaws of his father, as well as his own experiences in his youth. I think his writing style, particularly in The Audacity of Hope, is a very clear, compelling style. It gets to the issues, but it also has, again, his personal experiences. He's able to bring himself in ways that I don't think are trite or very common in these kind of books.
Do you see a difference after he became a senator or, you know, a well-known politician in the writing style between the two books?
Well, I think certainly The Audacity of Hope is written a little more carefully with an eye to, I don't want to do anything to embarrass myself or really, you know, take any deeply controversial stands. I think that's true of any politician, whereas, you know, Dreams from My Father was something written before he went into politics, before he had that kind of political career, before I think he was really thinking about those kinds of things.
202 is our area code, 737-0001 if you live in the East and Central time zones, 202-737-0002 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. We'll begin taking your calls in just a minute, but first we wanted to show you, we covered, Book TV covered Barack Obama in 2000, we covered him when he was on book tour for Dreams from My Father. Here he was talking about the book.
What this book is about is a boy who's growing up and doesn't have a father around. And what I start with is the story of my father passing away, killed in a car accident, a father that I did not know well, somebody who had been part of that first generation of Africans to study in the United States, and then had married an American woman, had had a child, but then had gone back to his own country, thinking that somehow he would be able to bring back technology and transformation through the knowledge that he had gained to help develop a country that was newly free. And I didn't really know his story very well. All I knew about my father, for the most part during my upbringing, was the stories that my mother told me. So I had a whole mythology about who he was. Fortunately, the mythology that my mother fed me was a very positive image. So I write about the fact that in the book, I grew up with an image of a strong black man who just didn't happen to be in the house, but was one of the smartest and most charismatic and brightest and honest people that you would ever care to meet. And so that was a mythology that I carried with me despite his absence and despite living in a very different world than his. And it was only later that I started realizing that in fact this was a mythology, that his life was much more complex. And as a consequence of that realization, I've rebelled in all sorts of ways and went through a lot of difficulties that are not unique to me. In fact, particularly among African American males, without fathers in the house, buffeted by a series of negative stereotypes that they see, or at least confining stereotypes of what it means to be a black man in America, that as a consequence of those things, I went in a whole negative direction that lasted throughout most of my teenage years. And what the book discusses then is how did I pull myself out of it, and it ended up being a matter of me recognizing that the struggles that I was going through internally to reconcile a divided heritage, to reconcile the different strands of my past, could only be done if I linked my story up with the larger story, the story of struggle taking place here in the United States with African Americans, the struggle that's taking place overseas with the millions of people who are impoverished and don't have opportunity. And that's part of what led me directly into the community organizing work that I did, the civil rights work that I did, and ultimately into the politics that I'm still engaged in. And so, in some ways, the themes of this book are very much the project of my life right now, which is to figure out how, in fact, can we live together as one people effectively. And what does that mean? And what does that require? And what are the nature of our commitments to each other? And what's the scope of our regard and concern?
What did you hear?
Well, I think you hear in that excerpt part of what he's talking about the book, some of the struggles he went through as a youth. And again, you know, I think one of the things that shows that Obama is not an elitist in the sense he doesn't come from a privileged background like so many politicians do. He's gone through these kind of struggles as a youth that he's had to deal with all these kinds of issues, partly stemming from his father's absence. And it really was for him a choice that he could have chosen this really rebellious outlet, this way of giving up on kind of the American dream and on American society and going down to the roots of cynicism and worse. But he instead went the opposite way, that instead this kind of background, I think, made him someone who was very hopeful, who had a very optimistic outlook.
Well, I want to read two quotes from Dreams from My Father to you and get your response. I learned to slip back and forth between my black and white worlds, understanding that each possessed its own language and customs and structures of meaning, convinced that with a bit of translation on my part, the two worlds would eventually cohere. Junkie, pothead, that's where I'd been headed, the final fatal role of the young would-be black man. Except the highs hadn't been about that, me trying to prove what a down brother I was. Not by then anyway. I got high for just the opposite effect, something that could push questions of who I was out of my mind, something that could flatten out the landscapes of my heart, blur the edges of my memory.
Well, and I think he's talking, and that's sort of his background as an African American, having to exist in these two worlds, which he's had to do his whole life of being an African American, but also working within this white world, whether it's the white world of the University of Chicago or of elite colleges or Chicago city politics or Illinois state politics or the U.S. Senate, that he has to function within this predominantly white world, as well as the world he's very familiar with from his mother, his grandparents. And yet at the same time, the world looks at him as an African American. He is black, and he connects with that world. And for him, it's really about bridging those two worlds. I think that's been what he's been able to do both personally as well as politically. When, in your view, did he reconcile those two worlds? Well, I think one of the ways that he tried to reconcile those two worlds was when he became a community organizer in Chicago after college in his early 20s. And I think it was his way of going from these elite white worlds of, say, Columbia University and not going into the traditional world he could have gone to, becoming the corporate world, going into these kind of approaches. Instead, he goes to the black community on the south side of Chicago, and he tries to work with them. And what he's really doing with them is connecting the black community with the white political establishment in Chicago, trying to find ways of bringing them together, doing this community organizing so that these black people will have a voice in this white world of politics.
John K. Wilson is our guest. Here's his biography of Barack Obama. This Improbable Quest is the name of the book. And we are talking about Barack Obama's two bestsellers, Dreams from My Father, first out in 1995, reissued in 2004, and Audacity of Hope, 2006 issue. Middletown, Maryland, you are first up. Go ahead with your question for our guest.
Hi, I'd like to ask to your guest about what he thinks White House justification, let's say, start with the, almost limiting, I don't know, I'm looking for a word here, our civil liberties, not to mention torture laws and everything. I'm talking about White House lawyers like David Addington, chief counsel to Cheney, excuse me, and other bunch of lawyers working behind the closed doors, secrecy, and coming up loopholes about around our Constitution and justifying that.
So, caller, what's your question?
Question is what your guests think about the current White House lawyers going around and, around the law. And
Mr. Wilson, do you have any response
Well,
to that
I
caller?
think that's where Barack Obama's background as a constitutional law professor and his deep experience in that is so important, because you will have somebody in the Oval Office who actually understands the Constitution, who deeply believes in civil liberties and civil rights. And that's a fundamental contrast with what the Bush administration has done.
What in his background would influence how he feels about certain laws? Particularly what that caller was referring to.
Well, I think he's someone who's been very committed to the notion of civil rights in particular. And really, the civil rights movement is something that had a deep influence on him. And it's the civil rights movement, frankly, that is the springboard in America for the civil liberties movement. That a lot of the ideas and the activism for civil liberties is an offshoot of the civil rights movement. And that's where I think Obama is so knowledgeable, that he has that background in civil rights and civil knowledge. He worked as a civil rights lawyer. He taught constitutional law. He understands these issues and is committed to these kind of values that you don't find in the current Bush administration.
From Audacity of Hope, I have to side with Justice Breyer's view of the Constitution that it is not a static but rather living document and must be read in the context of an ever-changing world.
Yeah, and that's a standard interpretation of the Constitution, and you even see that even conservative judges, for example, in the past year, in trying to understand the Second Amendment dealing with gun rights, they have to understand it in the context of a society. It's not trying to understand things that happened in 1787. It's trying to apply the principles to a modern age, and that's what the concept of a living Constitution is.
Our next call comes from Miami. Good afternoon. You're on the air.
Yeah, one problem I have with Barack Obama is that he seems very vague. We don't see any old friends from Punahou. His college thesis is missing. There weren't many writings for his law review. And maybe you could enlighten us. One of his mentors when he was a young man was Frank Marshall Davis, and he's been described as a radical, even a communist, I think, in the 50s. But that's not my interest. Frank Marshall Davis also wrote an autobiography in '68, which was called Sex Rebel, and he admitted to bisexualism and sex with minors. And this is relevant. I know sex is not in the purview of candidates, but Larry Sinclair has accused Barack Obama of a homosexual relationship and at the same time doing drugs. I'd just like your opinion of or maybe a little enlightenment about the relationship between Barack Obama and Frank Marshall Davis. And
John K. Wilson.
Well, that call combined a lot of the various smears against Barack Obama that you hear out there, and it's an example of what this election is turning into. It's a question of whether people will believe the lies and smears, as in the case of Larry Sinclair.
Who is Larry Sinclair?
He's a felon who actually failed a lie detector test, who has made all these bizarre accusations that nobody believes about Obama. But the initial question asked by the caller was about Frank Marshall Davis, who's again the kind of guilt by association attacks that have been launched against Barack Obama.
Who is Frank Marshall Davis?
He was a friend of Obama's grandfather, and a black who's a radical, who's a left-winger, accused of being a communist, and probably was. He was a poet in Hawaii, and Obama spent time with him, talked to him. People have used the word mentor. He wasn't so much a mentor. He was someone who Obama, in African American Hawaii, who Obama felt comfortable talking to about some of the racial issues that he was struggling with as a teenager. But again, this kind of notion that Obama is somehow guilty of being a left-winger because, as a kid he talked to a guy who was a poet who happened to be a communist is just the kind of worst guilt by association smears that you hear out there.
What about that caller's description of Barack Obama as vague?
Well, I don't understand the whole notion of vagueness. You can look at, for example, Barack Obama's acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention was much more specific than John McCain's speech. his website has lots more specifics than McCain's website does of particular policies he's going to enact. There's all kinds of very specific things that Barack Obama talks about in his book about his background. There is no one, I think, in the history of American politics who has run for president who has written an autobiography as detailed about his past or has gotten more scrutiny about his early life than Barack Obama. So this whole notion of vagueness, I think, is a complete myth. I don't see any basis for it.
Jackson, Wyoming.
Yes, good morning. You know, I'm a Barack Obama supporter, though I believe that the ticket should be in reverse. I think Biden should be president and Obama vice president. But anyway, I was kind of disappointed with Barack Obama when he was intimidated into wearing the American flag. You know, as if wearing the American flag means you're a patriot. I think that he was intimidated by McCain to go over to see Iraq, even though that turned out to be a pretty good decision on his part. And his situation being involved in drugs, he doesn't ever mention the fact of America having the largest prison population in the world, and that he could have been in prison if he was caught with drugs, and he doesn't ever mention about the drug war and how much money is being wasted in that. And one other point is that I just think that he should refrain from as much talking about religion as possible, because this country is based on, you know, we're a secular state, and we shouldn't be talking about religion as much as we are. I appreciate responses to this. Thank you very much.
Well, there's a lot there. On the religion issue, I think Obama, has a very thoughtful way of approaching it. He talks about religion in The Audacity of Hope, and what he's saying about that is that not that he wants to bring government and religion together. He believes in the separation of church and state, but he also believes that it's important for people to express religious values and to allow their ideas to be influenced by religious values. So, and on those other issues of where Obama, you know, the idea that he was intimidated by his critics, I think the fact is that a lot of people have challenged Obama on you know, for a time he wasn't wearing an American flag pin. He hadn't been to Iraq, and Obama rises to those challenges. He says, you know, if you think of, you know, going to Iraq is so essential, I'm going to go to Iraq and I'm going to go to these places, and that he doesn't have anything against American flag pins. Obviously he supports the American flag. He just objected to the idea that it was purely a symbol for a certain kind of politics he didn't like, and I think what he's trying to do is take back the symbols of those patriotism.
From Audacity of Hope, here is Barack Obama writing about religion. I am suggesting that if we progressives shed some of our own biases, we might recognize the values that both religious and secular people share when it comes to the moral and material direction of our country. We might recognize that the call to sacrifice on behalf of the next generation, the need to think in terms of thou and not just I, resonates in religious congregations across the country. We need to take faith seriously, not simply to block the religious right, but to engage all persons of faith in the larger project of American renewal.
And I think that's what Obama is trying to do, is to take back the faith issue from the right wing, who's hijacked religion and tried to use it for radical conservative policy proposals. And Obama is saying that, as he said before, you know, that liberals have faith too, that God is not something that belongs to the Republicans.
Now, if you could explain why he includes this in his faith argument. Many of the leading lights of the revolution, most notably Franklin and Jefferson, were deists who, while believing in an almighty God, questioned not only the dogmas of the Christian church, but the central tenets of Christianity itself, including Christ's divinity. Jefferson and Madison, in particular, argued for what Jefferson called a wall of separation between church and state as a means of protecting individual liberty in religious belief and practice, guarding the state against sectarian strife, and defending organized religion against the state's encroachment or undue influence.
Well, it's certainly true that a lot of early presidents, like Jefferson, for example, who went through and actually cut parts out of the Bible about Christ's divinity that he didn't agree with. He actually, you know, mutilated his own Bible, which is something I don't think any political candidate could get away with today. But the wall of separation is not just a kind of secular notion. For Barack Obama in particular, it's essential to protect religion. The idea is you don't want to have religion start to being hijacked by government intruding upon it, by government doing all these things that infringe upon religious liberty, just as you don't want religious orthodoxy to intrude upon the rights of people who disagree.
This is In Depth for the month of September. Our guest for the first half is John K. Wilson, who is a biographer of Barack Obama. This Improbable Quest is the name of his book. Macomb, Georgia, you're on the air.
Yes. Thanks for taking my call, first of all. I have read everything Barack Obama has written, and I've enjoyed all of his books. And when he ran for president, I immediately went on research. I want to know about the people that's going to be in office. But my thing is basically, I keep hearing people calling and talking about him being a Muslim and being in Indonesia. Was it wrong for him as a child to go where his mother took him?
Caller, before we get an answer, two questions for you. What was your favorite Barack Obama book? Was it Dreams from My Father or Audacity of Hope?
Dreams from My Father, because
Why?
I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and my father was killed in a car accident when I was 2, and my mother raised 9 children totally by herself. But you know what? We did okay. We did okay.
And what did you learn about Barack Obama in reading his books?
I learned that Barack Obama cares for people. He did whatever he thought he had to do to pull himself up and get from that little child that had nowhere to go to be where he. As a matter of fact, I have a grandson that's trying to inspire his life by Barack. He got a big sign over his bed. I'm going to be somebody in this world.
Thank you, caller. And she asked about Indonesia. Here from Dreams from My Father, in Indonesia, I had spent 2 years at a Muslim school, 2 years at a Catholic school. In the Muslim school, the teacher wrote to tell my mother that I made faces during Quranic studies. My mother wasn't overly concerned.
Well, just to clarify on that, when he says Muslim school, it was actually a public school. It was predominantly Muslim, but it was a public school in Indonesia. What they do in public schools in Indonesia at the time was a couple of times a week they had religious classes. And they had religious classes, some were Muslim, dealing with the Quran, and some were Catholic, I think, or Christian. And so Obama went to the Muslim classes in the school, but it wasn't a Muslim school, which is one of the false accusations you get. And Barack Obama was never a Muslim. And in fact, it's really ironic that you have these kind of hateful accusations, that being a Muslim is somehow appalling, even though it's not true. Particularly because the truth is that Barack Obama was raised by atheists. His mother was an atheist, his father was an atheist, his grandparents were atheists, and
his mother's parents.
Yes, his mother's parents were, and what I think was important about that, though, is that they weren't secularists in the sense of trying to keep him from any exposure to religion. To the contrary, his mother was an anthropologist, and she tried to expose him to a wide range of religions, including Islam, including Christianity, and all of the world's religions. And so what happened is that Obama really grew up without orthodoxy. He didn't have religion forced upon him. He became a Christian as a matter of choice as an adult. It wasn't something that he did just because his family did or just because it was some sort of traditional thing to do. It was an active choice that he made.
Next call for John Wilson, Hobe Sound, Florida.
Hey, good afternoon, and you got it right this time.
I was scared.
You got it right. Good for you. What inspired me to call was the introduction of this guest when he spoke about how he was inspired, he began to like Barack Obama because he took a course in race and the law at the University of Chicago Law School. Now, Barack Obama has said numerous times that he wants to get away from all that stuff from the 1960s. But it seems to me that his whole life is all about all that stuff from the 1960s to the course, from the course that he taught at the University of Chicago Law School to the church that he joined, an Afrocentric church where the preacher is anti-American and goddamn America and all that stuff. So it's the 1960s that seems to be at the core of Barack Obama's whole life. And he, far from looking to get away from it, he's looking to, and look at his acceptance speech. It's all the Democratic stuff from the 1960s. He's not looking to get away from the 1960s. He is the 1960s.
No, I don't think that's true at all. And I think Obama, of course, says we shouldn't just ignore race. We shouldn't pretend that race doesn't matter, that there's no discrimination, there's no racism out there at all. What he's saying is that we need to overcome that kind of racism. And one of the themes of his class was about employment discrimination, is the idea that everyone should have equal rights in terms of getting a job. And that's what he did as a lawyer, also dealing with, to a certain extent, of civil rights cases of employment discrimination. The idea not to focus on race, but to try and get us beyond race by trying to end discrimination. And as for his policy proposals, I don't think in any way Obama is stuck in the 60s or traditional liberal proposals. I think he's looking for a new way of approaching things. He rejects what is the failed policies of the Bush administration and the conservative movement, clearly. But you know, he's been very clear that he's not looking to go back to the 60s. He's not looking to go to a welfare state. What he's trying to do is put together a different line for government policies where you're helping people, where the government is not powerless, but you're not trying to do everything for the American public. You're trying to do as much as you can to encourage them, to educate them, to train them, so that they can succeed on their own.
Next call, Hamlet, North Carolina. Go ahead, North Carolina.
Okay. Enjoy watching your show. I've been watching your show. I've been trying to get in, and
tell you what, Hamlet, North Carolina, we're going to put you on hold. Turn down the volume on your TV, otherwise you get a little bit of feedback. Just listen through your telephone, okay? We will come right back to you. And if you can get a little closer to your base or get a little better clarity on the phone, that would be helpful too. Lynchburg, Virginia, you're on with John Wilson. We're talking about Barack Obama's books. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, gentlemen, and good afternoon, America. Well, you know, much in the campaign, the campaign of Barack Obama has made a great deal about his Ivy League success, how he went to Columbia University and then on to Harvard. But if I recall, Barack Obama was not an A student in high school, and he also experimented with drugs in his late teens. So doesn't it seem pretty obvious that the reason Barack Obama got into Columbia has everything to do with affirmative action?
John Wilson.
Actually, there's no evidence of that. I don't actually know his grades in high school. In his book, he talks about how he was a bit of a slacker, but you know, I was a bit of a slacker in high school too, and I got very good grades. So they're certainly not incompatible. The reason why he went to Columbia is that initially he went to college at Occidental College in Los Angeles, and they had a transfer program with Columbia for students who were already there. So I don't see any evidence of a kind of affirmative action, which is, by the way, very much in contrast with John McCain, who's someone who almost certainly got into the Naval Academy because his father and his grandfather were admirals, and he probably would have flunked out of the Naval Academy if not for his elite status. So I think if any of the candidates is a beneficiary of affirmative action, we can be pretty sure that, you know, George W. Bush was, John McCain probably was, but there's really no evidence of that for Barack Obama.
Has he released his high school transcripts?
I don't know if anybody's ever asked for them. I don't know why anyone would care, but so I don't know the answer to that question.
Hamlet, North Carolina, you're on. Please go ahead.
okay, yes. Can you hear me?
Please go ahead.
Yes. Yes, I was watching the show earlier this morning, and I couldn't get in. I wanted to comment on the racial aspects about it. my thing is I think it is going to come to the race part of the election. And what I wanted to state is the swing states that's involved in these elections, that, you know, they could be the ones that could turn this election around. I think the whole world needs to come together and forget about this racial thing. With the whole United States is in a lot of trouble. Not just here, it's all over the world. And the world is watching us and seeing if we could come together. And we stand divided, we fall.
Thank you, caller.
Well, I think on the racial issue, and someone earlier, the caller brought up Jeremiah Wright and Obama's whole status with being a member of a predominantly African-American church where the preacher expresses controversial ideas. And I don't think that has anything really to do with race. I think what it had to do was with Barack Obama's willingness to listen to people he disagrees with, whether they're on the right and the left. And it would never have occurred to Barack Obama to leave a church because the pastor was saying controversial things. Again, as I mentioned earlier, he came to Christianity as a voluntary thing. He never was brought up in religion as an orthodoxy, and so it never would have occurred to him that you just leave a church because you disagree with the pastor about something. It wouldn't have occurred to him to leave the University of Chicago because he disagreed with a liberal or a conservative professor there. It's part of deeply entwined in Barack Obama's personality is the idea of getting along with everybody, of listening to all different points of view, even when you don't agree with them.
From Dreams from My Father, Malcolm X's repeated acts of self-creation spoke to me. The blunt poetry of his words, his unadorned insistence on respect, promised a new and uncompromising order, martial in its discipline, forged through the sheer force of will. All the other stuff, the talk of blue-eyed devils and apocalypse, was incidental to that program. I decided religious baggage that Malcolm himself seemed to have safely abandoned toward the end of his life.
And I think that reflects what Obama tries to do, is when he reads someone who's complex and, like Malcolm X, complex and full of lots of ideas, many of them controversial and wrong, that he tries to take the best of those ideas and not focus on just the things that he thinks are wrong-headed.
Austin, Texas, you're on with John Wilson. We're talking about Barack Obama's books.
Yes, a pleasure to be in the program today. I just would like to know, how can we explain to the world that Obama has been in the media so much because we claim that we can't believe in his Christianity or his religions? What kind of message is that we are trying to tell for the Muslims, accusing Obama of being a Muslim?
Well, and that certainly reflects a lot of the anti-Muslim prejudice in this country, where there is this, where being a Muslim is regarded as a smear, and that reflects, I think, an alarming thing. And Barack Obama has spoken out about this as well, that he's not a Muslim, he's a Christian. There's no doubt about that. He never was a Muslim, but it still shouldn't be used as a smear against him and against all Muslims.
Next call is Hyattsville, Maryland. You're on the air.
Good afternoon, gentlemen, and thank you so much, C-SPAN. I've been thinking about calling you all for the last couple of days. I wanted to ask two questions, and they kind of relate to one another in terms of the lack of coverage that Obama is getting in terms of who he is. And I'm looking here at some information about how Obama is a Harvard graduate, a constitutional had been a constitutional lawyer and professor. And one thing that I thought I did learn in school is that we do elect our president to uphold the Constitution, the laws of the United States. Two, I don't understand why we're not getting information about the legislation that Obama have passed. Partisan, bipartisan, since 1999 when he was in the state Senate and as a senator in the United States Congress. And one particular bill that really caught my attention was a Google-like database for the public to research details about the federal funding awards. And what had happened is that this bill created like a Google-like database on information of federal spending. and they have like a number of information that should be available to people, such as the amount, the transaction type, the funding agency. You know, what is the program source? Was it an award, title, descriptive?
And what's your point here, caller?
Point is that, you know, I'm looking at information about nuclear, lockdown, loose nuclear weapons. Why have we not, or the media, or even you, C-SPAN, when someone calls and say that Obama has no experience in Congress or the Constitution, why isn't there someone saying, well, you know, he's a constitutional lawyer, which the President of the United States should uphold those laws, or, you know what, he did pass some legislation. It was some very significant legislation.
All right, thanks.
And I think that's very important because earlier this week, Sarah Palin, the vice presidential candidate for John McCain, declared that Obama has written two memoirs, but he's never done a single significant piece of legislation, which is just utterly false. And, you know, there's a whole litany of legislation we can go through in the state Senate as well as the U.S. Senate. The caller mentioned the database about earmarks. And to me that's notable. First of all, he did that with Tom Coburn, a conservative Republican. He's shown he can work across party lines on that and many other issues to get things passed. But it's also notable because here you have John McCain, who says he's deeply opposed to earmarks, but, you know, in just a few years in the Senate, Barack Obama actually passed this legislation to help get earmark reform done, something John McCain has never accomplished in his 26 years. And so, as well as the fact that McCain appoints as a vice president, Sarah Palin, vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin, who's deeply entwined with earmarks and the corrupt system of earmarks in Alaska. So you really have to wonder, with all these attacks on Obama for not getting anything done, people are just missing what is a very clear record out there. You can go search for it on the internet, or I can tell you about it, that he's passed all of this numerous forms of legislation.
You have a website, obamapolitics.com.
Right.
What is on that site?
Well, a lot of that site is to do with my blog entries of going through about the campaign. There's also information about the book, but a lot of it is going through, in many cases, responding to a lot of the attacks on Obama that have been going on. All of these anti-Obama books by Jerome Corsi and David Freddoso, who have done really a lot of the errors and mistakes and smears that are out there about Obama.
John Wilson, Sarah Palin in her acceptance speech Wednesday night said that the presidency is not a journey of self-discovery. George W. Bush had a moment of a turning point when he quit drinking. John McCain being in a prison camp. Did Barack Obama, does he write about a turning point in his life?
I don't think he has a dramatic turning point. He doesn't have that kind of moment of conversion to something. And I think that in many ways that's one of his virtues, that he's someone who's very steady, who's not somebody who makes these radical swings in ideology from the left or the right. He's someone who's been very consistent throughout his life about his values and his beliefs, and you know, there isn't any real single moment that you can point to that shaped what he thinks.
Next call for John Wilson, Irvine, California.
Hello, thank you so much for calling. Thank you so much for accepting my call. I am an Indonesian American, and I actually have been following Senator Obama ever since his speech in 2004, and I wanted to actually clarify. A lot of people make an assumption about the public school when he stated that he was studying for in Muslim school. In Indonesia, public school, we recognize 5 different religions, and definitely that does not mean that he was practicing as Muslim or not. Having said that, it doesn't mean that I am a Christian growing up in Indonesia, and I don't see that should be an issue, even though it is an issue here in America, obviously, during this election. My question to the author is that what value do you think that lead Senator Obama to make a decision to run or choose running through Senate in his early days as a Democrat rather than as a Republican?
Well, I think one of the things that shaped that was the death of his parents. His father, of course, who died in a car accident when he was very young. His father was young at the time. His mother died, I believe, at the age of 52. And those things really taught him a lesson about not waiting to live life. And I think that's one of the things, actually, that shaped him in his desire to run for office now, because he knows you can't predict the future. You can't know what it's going to be like. I think another reason why he did that, and this is something he talks about in The Audacity of Hope, is that the longer you stay in the Senate, the further away from regular people you get. You become surrounded by consultants and wealthy donors, and these are the people you have to go to get your money to run for re-election. And these are the people constantly surrounding you in Washington, the lobbyists and everything else. And I think Barack Obama felt the longer he was going to be in Washington, the more likely he was going to be distant from what the regular American people think. And so I think he saw this as the ideal moment, both politically and personally, for him to pursue this.
Speaking of that, he writes in Audacity of Hope about campaigning. Just a couple quick quotes, want to get your response to this. For the first time in my career, and this was early, I began to experience the envy of seeing younger politicians succeed where I had failed, moving into higher offices, getting more things done. The pleasures of politics, the adrenaline of debate, the animal warmth of shaking hands and plunging into a crowd began to pale against the meaner tasks of the job. The begging for money, the long drives home after a banquet had run 2 hours longer than scheduled, the bad food and stale air and clipped phone conversations with a wife who had stuck by me so far but was pretty fed up with raising our children alone and was beginning to question my priorities. And then he goes on here to say about campaigning, where he's, this is for the Illinois State Senate. I had to rely on friends or acquaintances to open their houses to whoever might come, or to arrange for my visit to their church, union hall, bridge groups, or Rotary Club. Sometimes after several hours of driving, I would find just 2 or 3 people waiting for me around a kitchen table. I would have to assure the host that the turnout was fine and compliment them on the refreshments they'd prepared. Sometimes I would sit through a church service and the pastor would forget to recognize me, or the head of the union local would let me speak to his members just before announcing that the union had decided to endorse someone else. What does that say?
Well, I think one of the things that's important about that is that it shows how Obama has experienced the kind of retail politics on the very small level of dealing with people one-on-one.
Do you get that he enjoys it?
Well, I think he enjoys it, I think. But of course, like anything, you know, dealing with the same kind of routines over and over of campaigning and raising money, I think it's something that he didn't want to do for the next 30 years, that he didn't want to go through that cycle of being a professional politician forever. It's not something that sort of he really likes. The idea of helping people and talking to people and that kind of thing, I'm sure he enjoys, but the process of a kind of corrupt political system we live in is something that he doesn't enjoy nearly as much.
And finally, from Audacity, few people end up being U.S. senators by accident. At a minimum, it requires a certain megalomania, a belief that of all the gifted people in your state, you are somehow uniquely qualified to speak on their behalf, a belief sufficiently strong that you are willing to endure the sometimes uplifting, occasionally harrowing, but always slightly ridiculous process we call campaigns.
Right, and that's true of any candidate for president. There are no modest candidates for president out there. There are no non-elitist candidates for president out there. They're all part of a political elite. They all have a certain arrogance to them. And so I think it's vaguely ridiculous to try and paint the people who paint Barack Obama as an elitist. This idea that just because he wants to be president, that's true of all of the other presidents we've had. They've all wanted to be president, and many more have as well.
Evergreen, Alabama, thanks for holding. You're on with John Wilson.
Thank you for taking my call. It's really about the race thing. I don't understand how America could be so one-sided. They talk about black people voting for Obama overwhelmingly, and ever since black people have been allowed to vote, they've been voting for white people, so what is the difference?
And about Obama and drug use, that was as a child. George Bush used drugs and drank and whatever else. That's behind them. So I don't understand, why people keep dragging up a whole bunch of stuff that has nothing to do with what we are facing today and who are better qualified to get us out of the mess that the experienced people have gotten us in. They talk about inexperience. Well, bring on the inexperience, because the experience has put us in one heck of a mess.
Thank you, caller.
Well, I think the experience issue is a very important one to bring up, particularly because you've had, in this past week, a series of lies told at the Republican National Convention where Fred Thompson and Rudy Giuliani went up there and said, that Obama is the most inexperienced candidate for president in the past 100 years or even in American history. And that's something that's been said by David Freddoso in his book. It's been said by George Will in a column this week, and it's just utterly, completely false. I did a study of it. Barack Obama had 8 years in the state Senate and 4 years in the U.S. Senate. And so I went through all of the presidents, all 43 presidents, and looked at how many years of experience as an elected public official at the state and federal level do they have. What's interesting is only 17 out of 43 presidents have more experience than Barack Obama. If you look just at the national experience in Washington, foreign policy experience as an elected public official, only 22 out of 43 presidents have more experience than Barack Obama. So if you look at the experience issue, first of all, Barack Obama is more experienced than Fred Thompson or Rudy Giuliani, who were condemning him as inexperienced, but he's more experienced than the typical president. The other issue about experience that's very interesting is that if you look at our American history, it's terrible for a presidential candidate to have experience. The worst presidents are the ones with the most experience. I looked at a study, for example, ranking the presidents that was done by the Wall Street Journal and the Right-Wing Federalist Society. And they ranked all the presidents. They asked prominent professors, weighted them equally by Democratic and Republican professors, who were the best presidents and the worst presidents. Out of the 10 best presidents, the great or nearly great presidents, 8 of them had less experience than Obama does now when they were elected. Such as, well, George Washington, for example, didn't have a large amount of experience. Even Ronald Reagan, who's someone mentioned, had 8 years as governor, less experience than Obama, no foreign policy experience. And if you looked at the 5 worst presidents, the failures, according to this ranking by these conservative groups, all 5 of them had more experience than Barack Obama does. So if you look at the experience issue, not only, first of all, you have to address the lie that Barack Obama is inexperienced, because he's not. He has a very typical amount of experience. But then you have to look at the issue of the fact that experience is generally a bad thing for a president to have, because it means you're tied up with the status quo in Washington. You're not someone who's going to challenge the existing ideas. You're not someone who's going to bring change. And I think that's what Obama really is going to bring. And if Obama has a problem, frankly, it's that he has too much experience, historically speaking.
I want to use this email to ask you about what he writes about his educational years. Gary writes in, please answer about the years at Columbia, his roommates. Why has there been nobody from his past talking about their knowing him?
Well, there's been plenty of people in his past. You can look at all these biographical articles about him in the press. He's gotten more scrutiny and coverage, I think, than any other presidential candidate in history. I don't know. Not everybody wants to talk to the press. I'm not sure who John McCain's roommates were or how much discussion or analysis there's been of that, but there's been plenty of people in Barack Obama's past who have talked about their admiration for him and what they've had to say about him. I don't think, asking a college roommate about somebody is necessarily the best way to find out anything important about them.
How much writing does he do about his educational years?
It's not the focus so much of his book, and Dreams from My Father, and that, because again, it's not something particularly interesting. The college years consisted of going to classes and that. He talks some about his struggles in New York City and at Columbia and trying to fit in with people and that. There's also, I think, some important things about his years at the Harvard Law Review that I think are very important, because he's someone, for example, there he graduates magna cum laude. He's one of the best students there. He's the president of the Harvard Law Review. And he really, in that case, brings together conservatives and liberals who both sides have expressed admiration for him and his years at the Harvard Law Review. And in fact, the reason why he got his job teaching law at the University of Chicago was because when he was the president of the Harvard Law Review, he was editing an article by Michael McConnell, who was then a professor of law at the University of Chicago. McConnell, who I've also had classes with, is one of the most conservative but brilliant legal jurists out there. He was on the short list for George W. Bush's Supreme Court appointees, but he was the one who recommended that Barack Obama should teach at the University of Chicago. And that sort of shows how in Obama's educational background, he really impressed a lot of people, both conservative and liberal, that he had a very bright mind.
From Audacity of Hope, at times in arguments with some of my friends on the left, I would find myself in the curious position of defending aspects of Reagan's worldview. I didn't understand why, for example, progressives should be less concerned about oppression behind the Iron Curtain than they were about brutality in Chile.
And I think that's true. I think that reflects, again, that Obama is not a creature of the 60s. He's the first candidate for the president who sort of takes us beyond the debates of the 60s. And he's someone who's not tied into some of the radical far-left notions that tended to overlook some of the flaws of the Soviet Union and of other regimes like Cuba that were critical of the United States. I think he's someone who does not see the world in Cold War terms. He doesn't view this as in that way, and so I think that presents a lot of opportunities for the United States to have a president who's not still fighting the Vietnam War.
Fresno, California, you're on In Depth. John Wilson is our guest.
I was wondering if the views on Barack Obama or his persona and his life and his history and his message is more readily received by younger Americans, say between younger voters 18 to 45, 18 to 50, because we've grown up in a multicultural environment and we're used to listening to many ideas, and we're not offended by someone else believing something different. And we do focus on those core aspects of our lives that are alike and giving other people the liberty and freedom to have their own beliefs. And just noticing that with the Republicans, I'm so turned off by their message because they just seem so radically hateful. And their message, even in their convention, they almost spew fear. They live off of it. And that's a scary thing for me, having grown up in this country, to see people that are inspired by lies, promoting hate, and violence.
Well, I think that's true that there is a definite generational divide in the voting, both during the primary and even during surveys today. And Barack Obama, more than any politician in recent memory, is just an extraordinary appeal to younger people. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is the issue of racism, that there is still racism alive and well in America. You even found it in the exit polls during the Democratic primaries, where in some states, such as West Virginia, you had up to 19% of the total Democratic voters saying they voted against Obama, and they did so partly because of race. So you have, even today, a substantial part of the electorate, even in the Democratic Party, willing to admit that they're racist. And those people tend predominantly to be older. And in some sense, racism is slowly dying off in America as you have an older group of people who are no longer alive, and you have a younger group replacing them in the electorate who don't embrace that same kind of racism.
Pembroke Pines, Florida.
Hi. Oh, okay.
Okay, we're going to lose Pembroke Pines, and we're going to move on to the other coast, to Los Angeles. Los Angeles, you're on the air.
Yes, hello. I have a comment and I have a question. First of all, Barack Obama, I'm really disappointed. He and McCain both have been both bought and paid for by AIPAC, which is an Israeli lobby, which is a very dangerous group of people.
Thank you, caller. Does Barack Obama write about AIPAC in his books?
He doesn't. I don't know if he writes a great deal about these kinds of issues. He is someone who's been a supporter of Israel. I think as he became a presidential candidate, became more emphatic in his support of Israel because of that kind of influence, not only just AIPAC, but within the media, where it's the perception you have to be emphatically pro-Israel or you're not qualified to be president. It's very interesting. Last year there was a case where the New York Times on the front page actually wrote an analysis of how inexperienced Barack Obama was in presidential politics because he dared to give a speech in which he said, "Nobody has suffered more than the Palestinian people." And that statement, even though it's emphatically true, everybody agrees with it, whether you blame it on the Palestinian government or the Arabs or the Israelis is another issue, but everyone agrees with it. But the mere citation of that statement prompted the New York Times on its front page to proclaim that and question his experience and his knowledge of politics. So I think Obama has been very careful in this election to be someone who's emphatically pro-Israel. But I think as president, he's going to be pro-Israel, but he's going to be someone who, unlike George W. Bush, can actually try and bring a peace agreement to the Middle East.
From the Chicago suburbs, Skokie, Illinois.
Yes, I think we can all agree that C-SPAN should get all of our votes as one of the best things on TV, and the wonderful hosts like Peter and the lady who screened my call. I wish the number was toll-free for those of us whose phones are not quite as good as we would like. You anticipated my comment about qualifications. He does technically meet them. And if he's not proper, then you should change them, put it in black and white. And has there ever been a case in American history, and Peter and John know better than I, of a person growing in office, doing better than anticipated?
Are you a Senator Obama supporter, caller?
Pardon me?
Are you a Senator Obama supporter?
I would say so. I'm worried about McCain and Palin's belief against abortion, which I think should be, as been said, safe, legal, and rare. If a condom breaks, if there's rape or incest, and it should be done ASAP, as quickly as possible.
Well, I think on the abortion issue, again, you have Barack Obama, who I think is more in the mainstream of the country, certainly compared to Sarah Palin, who opposes all abortion, even in the case of rape and incest, and McCain, who wants to ban all abortion except in those cases. So I think Barack Obama on that issue is much more in the mainstream, but again, you have in the case of John McCain, even though he's often posited in the media as a maverick, he actually wanted to choose a pro-choice candidate like Joe Lieberman as a VP, and he had to succumb to the right wing of his party and select Sarah Palin because of the abortion issue.
What about that caller's question about growing in office?
Well, I think all presidents have a certain amount of growth in office, although George W. Bush may be an exception to that. But no one is really prepared completely to be president the moment they step into office. Everybody has to adjust to it and has a certain amount of a learning curve. But in terms of the preparations for office, you have to look in some ways at how they can work in organizing people and organizing a large bureaucracy. And I think particularly in this election, when you have John McCain and Barack Obama, neither of whom have executive experience in public office, the way you really judge that is by looking at what they've done in other areas. And you have Barack Obama, who's organized a very successful voter registration drive in 1992 in Illinois, who was a community organizer, but also has run really the best and most effective political primary campaign in the history of American politics. Raised untold amount of money, has 2,500 employees, he's running untold number of volunteers. And so you have to look at how someone is effective in that kind of office of running their campaign and contrast that with John McCain, who literally ran his campaign into the ground in 2007 and only really became president, not because of his management skills as a campaigner, but simply because he has a popular appeal and had very weak opposition that divided the conservative vote.
In Barack Obama's two books, Dreams from My Father, The Audacity of Hope, do you see inconsistencies? Do you see growth? Do you see what would you critique in these books?
Well, I think in some ways the worst characteristic of Barack Obama is in many ways his best characteristic, his willingness to listen to other people, to try and hear the other side of the story. And I think unfortunately what that sometimes can lead him to is that he doesn't always take strong stands on issues. He isn't always out there leading the American people. He's trying in some ways to have a conversation, to find out what people think and try and work with them rather than trying to push through his ideas and his values. So I think in many ways that's his weakness, and many have identified his tendency to compromise, his tendency to work with the other side, which on the one hand is a political virtue, but for some people, including me on the left, it can be, I think, a flaw when he's too easily convinced to compromise.
From The Audacity of Hope, 2006, the Democratic Party has become a party of reaction. In reaction to a war that is ill-conceived, we appear suspicious of all military action. In reaction to those who proclaim the market can cure all ills, we resist efforts to use market principles to tackle pressing problems. In reaction to religious overreach, we equate tolerance with secularism and forfeit the moral language that would help infuse our policies with a larger meaning. We lose elections and hope for the courts to foil Republican plans. We lose the courts and wait for a White House scandal.
And I think that's an important point that Obama is making, is that he's trying to create a new kind of political movement, what I'd call a kind of pragmatic progressive movement that isn't just a reaction to the far right, isn't just a movement that says, well, let's stop the Republicans from all the evil they're going to do. It's trying to create a much more positive vision. And in many ways, I think Obama can be like like Ronald Reagan was for the Republican Party, a kind of figure who can bring people from the other side, but who can lead a movement towards a new set of values. And what Obama is saying is that we can't just be reactionary, we can't just hold on to everything that the Republicans oppose. We can chart a different path that incorporates some of these ideas that are embraced by the conservative movement of making use of market principles and things like that. But at the same time, we can reject the fundamental values that have failed of the Republican Party that brought us the scandals in Enron and today Fannie Mae and all of these things where you end up privatizing profit and socializing risk. And I think what Obama is trying to do is try and adapt these principles of the free market, of all of these ideas to a new age where he's not tied down by these old fights from the 1960s of old-style liberalism.
Forestville, Maryland, you're on the air.
Yeah, good afternoon, Mr. Wilson. Hello?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just calling on to ask Mr. Wilson, how does Mr. Obama, how should he deal with the race issue in the sense of being a black man and all that he has done and all that he has accomplished in his 47 years? How does he deal with that when it comes to becoming, or trying to become the president of the United States for the first time as a black man?
Well, I think one of the things he's trying to emphasize is that he's not a president for black people, he's a president for everybody. And he's been very strong in emphasizing that. And he also understands that the way to deal with race and racial discrimination is not necessarily the old-style democratic policies. He's questioned, for example, affirmative action. And I think what he sees as affirmative action is the idea of stopping discrimination, of providing educational opportunity for everybody, but not just giving preferences to people because they happen to be black. He said his own daughters shouldn't get preferences to admission to college just because they're black. They have all the privileges of his background and that he's affording them, that you should instead have a system of affirmative action that benefits the people who need it the most. And I think that's his approach to politics in general.
The issue of race permeates both of these books, and in fact, Dreams from My Father, the subtitle is A Story of Race and Inheritance.
Well, yes, and certainly race is fundamental to his own self-identity of being the son of a Kenyan, but being brought up by a white mother, by white grandparents, of living in this diverse culture in Hawaii and in Indonesia. And so a lot of his personal story is about dealing with that racial identity, and a lot of it actually is in some ways getting beyond race, that what you see in Barack Obama's career and in his life and what he talks about in this book is how he got beyond beyond mere racial identification, and saw himself as part of a larger movement of, for example, in the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was not about, in Obama's mind, was not about helping black people. It was about bringing equality. And it's these principles of equality and justice that he sees as fundamental to the issues of race and to the civil rights movement, not the issues of empowering a certain race.
Cincinnati, good afternoon. You're on with John Wilson.
Hello?
Cincinnati, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I read Dreams of My Father, and one of the things that has been brought up, I think, is that in the middle of the book, I have to tell you, I started getting a little annoyed because I felt like he was constantly bringing in the black experience and the difficulties that living in a white world created because he was black, and I did start getting a little uncomfortable. But I have to tell you, by the end of the book, he brought it all together. When he went over and visited his father's side and learned all about that part of his heritage, he brought it all together and was so clear about everybody has prejudice. Every culture has prejudice within it. Every society has prejudice within it. And that to use that as an excuse for a plight, or to use that, it doesn't hold water, you know, and he just totally brought it all together, which is why I think that he is the perfect person to be leading our country, because this book was written before he was a presidential candidate, before he went into politics. So it is so honest and sincere. It's not politically correct written where, somebody might hold him accountable for what he said. So therefore, you get the real man. And I feel if anybody is worried about Barack Obama and what he's really about, read Dreams of My Father, because that'll give you a really good indicator of how intelligent and how he sees things in such a greater perspective.
Thank you, caller. John
I would agree with that. I think for anyone who has some concern about racial issues and that Obama is a black candidate or whatever, just try and read that Dreams from My Father, and I think it shows you someone who doesn't see race in those traditional terms, someone who is looking for what unites people beyond race. And he does that by dealing with race, not by ignoring it.
A couple things from that caller. The middle of Dreams from My Father, it's about his community activism in Chicago. And why do you think she was offended by that or annoyed by that?
Well, I don't know. I guess we'd have to ask her. I mean, part of this is the question of, well, why did Barack Obama go to serve black community in the south side of Chicago rather than serving everyone? Well, the reason is, I think, because that's where he had a connection. That's where he could really provide a service to that community. The black community in the south side of Chicago was one of the poorest and most hopeless areas in the country, and I think he saw it as a place where he could go and first of all connect with the civil rights movement that he admired so much, but also do very important work that was very important to reaching these people without hope.
Why does he close Dreams from My Father with his visit to Kenya?
Well, I think that's important in terms of drawing together the whole story, of really understanding what his father was about and understanding and getting over the image of his father, this heroic image that he had of his father, and really understanding that his father was just another human being with flaws, with all of these things, and so the failings of his father, in many ways, I think he's trying to succeed in ways that his father failed at. His father, kind of a failed bureaucrat, a failed thinker, a failed intellectual, and I think Obama is in many ways trying to succeed at doing what his father tried to do, of serving in government and serving the people.
And finally, that caller said that this book is not written in a politically correct style. A lot of swearing in here, sexual references, drug references.
Well, no, that's certainly true. I imagine if John McCain had accurately portrayed whatever his life was in the Navy, that there probably were a few swear words there. And you know, I think that what Obama, he's not using these words, is really not his words. He's recording what's going on around him, the feelings that other people are having in terms of this offensive language or whatever. But he's trying to be very honest with people. I think he is very honest that this isn't a book motivated, it wasn't written for a political run. It was written, and it was not what he intended to write. He intended to write a more thoughtful policy book about race relations in America. But I think he ultimately understood that he needed to write a book about his own background to help himself understand that and before he could get to these issues.
Chicago, thanks for holding. You're on with John Wilson.
Hi. I just wanted to add, early on you were asking about Obama's friends, and I wanted to tell you that he does have a college friend that is an actor now, Hill Harper. He comes on CSI New York as a doctor. They went to law school together. So I just didn't know if the author remembers that or if he knew about that. So I just wanted to add that, and I am an Obama fan, and I'm hoping that he gets elected. Thank you very much.
You familiar with that?
No, I wasn't. I guess Obama does have a few celebrity friends in his background. Of course, John McCain is Fred Thompson, so maybe we could have a battle of the actors.
Poplar Bluff, Missouri, you're on the air.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you, C-SPAN. I am inspired. I'm an old man, and I'm inspired for the first time in many years by Mr. Obama's race. I think that he is an outstanding candidate for president. And the reason I think so is because of his multicultural background. I feel like the issues on the flag pins and the patriotism and things like that are all just smoke screens. And I'd like to ask Mr. Wilson, are we not still supposed to have a government for the people, by the people, and are not the Republicans that are speaking against him those that have the most to lose if he becomes president? They're mostly the ultra-rich that stand to have taxes perhaps raised on them, and some of their policies knocked down that embrace the rich. And thank you very much.
Well, I think that's true that you saw during the Republican National Convention, for example, a lot of them were mocking Barack Obama for being a community organizer. And to me, that's pretty extraordinary that someone who engages in this kind of low-paid public service for the people gets mocked by the Republican National Convention participants. And I think one of the reasons for that is because so much of the Republican Party is accustomed to talking to lobbyists, talking to people with lots of money. And community organizers are just sort of annoying to these politicians because they're trying to get regular people to communicate with politicians who don't have money, who don't have influence. And so that's why they're dismissing. The Republican Party has now become so committed to a party of lobbyists and the wealthy that the idea of being a community organizer is a big joke to them.
A few minutes left with our guest before we turn our attention to John McCain from Audacity of Hope, page 120. For a 3-year span from the time that I announced my candidacy for the Senate to the end of my first year as a senator, I was the beneficiary of unusually and at times undeservedly positive press coverage. No doubt some of this had to do with my status as an underdog in my Senate primary, as well as my novelty as a black candidate with an exotic background. Maybe it also had something to do with my style of communicating, which can be rambling, hesitant, and overly verbose, but which perhaps finds sympathy in the literary class.
Well, I think that last part is just a little bit of modesty on his part, but it is important on the whole issue of media coverage. He did get a lot of positive coverage early on, and he has gotten some in this campaign. I wrote an article for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting in their magazine Extra about the media bias against Obama and for McCain. And certainly there's no doubt that John McCain has also gotten a lot of positive media coverage, at least when he wasn't running his campaign to the ground in 2007. He got a lot of positive media coverage in general about his background. as has been documented by lots of people, and even conservative talk show hosts would have told you that before he became their nominee. But where you see the media bias, there have been some reports on it. The Center for the Study of Media and Public Affairs, but George Mason University, for example, a very conservative group, reported that the media coverage in the first month of the general election had been much more negative towards Obama than towards McCain. You've also gotten a lot of focus, I think, in the media on a lot of negative things in Barack Obama's background, Reverend Wright, Bill Ayers, all of these others, where there's been no attention to a lot of the negatives in John McCain's background. So I think on media bias, a lot of the kind of initial celebrity coverage of Obama was very positive, but you've had an enormous amount of media coverage attacking him, and as well as attacking his so-called inexperience. Not to mention, of course, what is the overwhelming media bias out there, which is all of the conservative talk shows that have been relentlessly attacking him. And clearly, Rush Limbaugh denouncing Barack Obama 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, to millions of people as the kind of media bias against Obama that no matter what you think of the mainstream media coverage, can't possibly be outweighed by it.
Does Barack Obama write about Bill Ayers or Reverend Wright in his books?
Well, he certainly writes about Reverend Wright. On the issue of Bill Ayers, I mean, there's no reason to write about Bill Ayers because he had a very small connection with him. He was part of the Chicago Annenberg Challenge doing school reform in Chicago, which Bill Ayers was involved with. He was on the Woods Fund, a charitable foundation where Bill Ayers was a part of that, and for a time was the chair. But I don't quite understand the attacks on Obama for having a connection to Bill Ayers, who, of course, in the 60s and 70s was part of the Weather Underground, which engaged in a lot of mostly symbolic kinds of bombings that didn't hurt anybody. In that, Barack Obama has condemned what Ayers did in the 70s. He's denounced the stupidity of what Ayers did, but I don't quite understand the idea that he was supposed to quit his job in the Woods Fund and quit doing charitable activities and quit doing school reform just because a former radical was also involved in doing these things. So, and to me, it's also a double standard because you don't see anyone talking about John McCain's connections to terrorism, his personal funding of the Contras in Nicaragua, his support for the criminal Oliver North, or the criminal G. Gordon Liddy, who he's called his friend. And nobody's asking any questions about John McCain's terrorist sympathizers that he's connected with, whereas you have a massive amount of coverage of the Bill Ayers issue.
John Wilson has been our guest. We've been discussing Barack Obama's two bestsellers, The Audacity of Hope, Dreams from My Father. John Wilson is the author of 4 or 5 books?
5 books.
5 books. This is his latest, Barack Obama, This Improbable Quest. ObamaPolitics.com is your website if people want to learn more about you or read your writing, correct?
That's right.
Thank you for being with us on In Depth on Book TV.
Thank you.
We're going to continue our unusual In Depth this month. And coming up next, Jonathan Karp, who has been John McCain's longtime editor.
I wish I could say that I got up early and I came to my computer and I put myself to work and I ate properly and I worked for several hours and had a full day's work. I kind of get up and I have tea and I sit in front of the window and maybe I look at the New York Times on the web, or if Glenn has gone to town to get it, look at that. Think about what I'm going to do. Go down to the treadmill, have some breakfast, and meander over to the computer.
I just get up and go right to it. I get up, have a cup of coffee, and that's that. I find I've got about 4 hours of limited intelligence, and many more hours, another 20 of no intelligence at all. And so I have to get moving right in the morning. And if things go well in that first 3 or 4 hours, then I can then push through for the rest of the day. but if I try and do something first, even something, as I'm forever explaining to my wife, something as simple as take the kids to school or make them breakfast, or even get their little little boots and hats on, my concentration is destroyed for the day. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
I have a writer's schedule, and so I generally get up at about 9:30 and put on the coffee, read the New York Times, then online go through a whole bunch of other sources I like to go to. Generally, I start writing something around 11:30 or noon. I don't eat breakfast. If I eat lunch, it tends to be late. And it depends, because I do a weekly column for the New York Sun. And writing day is usually Tuesday or Wednesday. And so if it's one of those days, then I'll get working on that. It generally takes about an hour for me to do a column. Usually I'll have done some sort of broad outline the night before. If I'm writing a book, then it's a matter of working up a kind of yeast, which usually for me is about a 60-page outline festooned with first draft text samples, and then making that into a book is a matter of taking the part of the outline that will correspond to that chapter and fleshing it out into something. And that's just a matter, especially with word processing technology, that's a matter of endless revision. I don't know what my process would have been 20 years ago when it was a matter of longhand and typewriters, but now it's a matter of taking that word processing document and just massaging it until it's right.
By afternoon, I'm really rolling, and then in the evening, I sort of have to tear myself away because I'm falling asleep or I'm not working very productively. So I would not recommend my way of working to others.
In Depth airs live at noon Eastern on the first Sunday of each month on Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Log on to booktv.org for information about upcoming guests.
The Book TV bus is traveling the country, visiting bookstores, libraries, festivals, and authors. Here are some of the people and places we visited.
Dr. Timothy Weston, co-editor of China's Transformations, the Stories Behind the Headlines. Dr. Weston, what are the stories behind the headlines in terms of China?
Well, there are a great many of them, of course. What we try to talk about in this volume, which is a collection of essays, invited essays by a number of different experts, academic, journalistic, and otherwise, are issues that often appear in the United States press or television news on the internet, but which do not get full coverage for the fact that you can only talk for a brief period of time in those venues. We talk in this book, authors talk in this book about the environmental crisis, the internet, joblessness, political dissidents, the Falun Gong movement, for example, many other topics as well.
Why did you write, or why did you edit this book? What got you interested in China?
Right. Well, this is actually the second edition of a book. It's an entirely new set of essays. It was originally published in the year 2000 under a separate title. We put it together originally based on a conference that we organized here at the University of Colorado at Boulder, primarily because at that time Deng Xiaoping had just died, and there was a lot of discussion in the news about China and in the transformations that Deng Xiaoping had helped to bring about in China. We felt that it was good coverage, but not deep enough, not broad-ranging enough, and so that was the reason for the conference that we originally had, and then we decided that it had the makings of a book. We wanted to produce a book that was very accessible to a general audience, as well as for classroom use in the colleges, and fortunately it's been adopted all over the country.
What does the media get wrong most about China?
I'm not sure the media gets things wrong per se, as much as what it does is tends to speak about China in a kind of formulaic way. China is either going to be our friend or it's going to be our foe. China is either a threat to us or it is going to be our ally. I think the reality of China is vastly more complex than that, and what we try to do in this volume is to bring that out in as many different ways as we possibly can. We also try very hard to locate places to talk about subjects where China and the United States actually have interlocking interests, or where they have comparable kinds of problems going on. So, for example, environmental degradation would be one of those. This is a problem, of course, that China has, as well as the United States has. It's a problem that the world has. We try to talk about this as a global phenomenon, and one that both China and the United States have to deal with. They need to talk about it together, and many other issues of that sort.
What part of China's transformation are you personally most fascinated by?
I'm most fascinated by the transformation from socialism to capitalism that has taken place, and the fact that you continue to have, despite the extraordinary changes taking place in the economic realm, a one-party state that does not really give much opportunity for ordinary people to have a role in the formulation of policy. My own essay in this volume deals with the crisis, the extraordinary crisis in the coal mining industry in China that's been playing out over the last several years and leading to a tragic number of deaths, terrible number of accidents in coal mines there that make China today comparable to the industrial revolutionary Great Britain and the coal mining disaster. So that's something I try and draw attention to here.
What is the future for China?
Future for China, well, that's everybody's major question, isn't it? I'm actually rather optimistic, but it depends on what you mean by optimism. I think that the leadership in China today is basically pragmatic, and if dealt with by other leaderships around the world in a pragmatic fashion, that there's reason to believe that the Chinese are going to work to solve problems that are common in nature around the world. I'll leave it at that for now.
Dr. Timothy Weston, co-editor of China's Transformations, The Stories Behind the Headlines. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much.
For more information about the Book TV Bus, visit our website at booktv.org/booktvbus.
Jonathan Karp, editor for John McCain. When did you first meet Senator McCain?
It was 1998, actually, and the story of how it came to us is actually a pretty good one. There was a literary agent, a very well-regarded and principled literary agent named Philippa Brophy, who's the president of Sterling Law Literaristic, and she had worked on Robert Tinberg's book, The Nightingale Song, and she thought that from reading that book that McCain would have a good story to tell. So she approached Mark Salter through Tinberg and suggested they write a proposal. And in January of 1998, that came to them, and Flip submitted it to a bunch of publishers. I was one of the editors who received it, and our publisher at the time is a woman named Ann Godoff. Ann recognized immediately how important the book was, and we prevailed. This was Random House. We prevailed in an auction for the book. So we began working on the book in January of 1998.
Faith of My Fathers.
Faith of My Fathers. Actually, yeah, we didn't have a title for it. I suggested calling it Family Honor, and I was told that it sounded too much like a mafia book. So Mark and John came up with Faith of My Fathers, and I think we knew immediately when they suggested that was the title of the book.
Why was John McCain sought after as an author in 1999 or 1998?
I think it was the Vietnam part of it, and this was never intended to be a political book. When Flip met with them, he was actually surprised that anybody would be interested in a book by him. And Flip said, well, have you ever thought about writing one? And he said, well, people have said, you know, you should do the profiles and courage kind of thing. And Flip said, well, everybody's done that. But if you were going to write about courageous people, who would you write about? And McCain apparently said, I would write about my father and my grandfather. And Flip said, that's the book. So they did that, and it was never perceived as being a political book. It was always a family memoir, and I actually think that's why the book has been such an enduring success, because it was about family.
How many copies?
Well, I've lost track. I mean, I know that it's sold probably well over 500,000. It might actually be closer to 1 million now, in light of all of the interest coming from the campaign. But it was, as of 2 years ago, it was over 500,000, so I can only assume it's much larger now.
A couple times now you've mentioned Mark Salter, and in all of John McCain's books, it all says John McCain with Mark Salter. Who is Mark Salter?
Mark Salter has been with McCain for over 20 years now. At the time the first book was written, he was his chief of staff. He started out as a legislative assistant. They met, I believe, at the Republican National Convention many years ago. And I can't remember the time. He was working with Jeane Kirkpatrick, I believe. Mark's a speechwriter.
And by the way, he's the gentleman with the goatee. This is John McCain walking out on Thursday in Minneapolis to do a sound check. Mark Salter walked out with him. He has the goatee.
Yes, he's a very smart man. He's a brilliant writer in his own right. And it's been said, in fact, in Robert Kaiser's Washington Post profile of McCain recently, said that they have a mind meld. They've been close associates, a band of brothers, comrades, for more than 20 years now. Mark is from Iowa. He has had kind of a colorful background in his own right. He worked on the railroads, I think played in a rock band, but he came to Washington, went to Georgetown, worked for Kirkpatrick, and it was, I think they were introduced by Torrey Clark, and he began his affiliation with McCain almost 20 years ago. I think that as a collaboration, it's one of the most unusual collaborations I've certainly seen, and it's by far the best collaboration I've ever had any connection with. But beyond that, I think for all collaborations, it's quite remarkable. 5 books over a 10-year period, something like 1,200 pages of writing, and really terrific storytelling in its own right. But getting back to Salter, I think he was always in the picture as the chief collaborator. And I remember when we first met with McCain, we said to him, you know, it would really be better if you were out front and center and you claimed the authorship of these books. And
that came from you?
Yes, from the publishing house. I was speaking for the publishing house, and I should probably just say for a second that I am here only because I am the principal editorial liaison. There have been hundreds of people with both Random House and the Hachette Book Group who have worked on behalf of these books. Many, many people have contributed to their success, and I'm only here as the one talking about it because I'm the one they were talking to on the phone mostly. But anyway, any publishing company would tell any famous politician, you should be the author and keep the collaborator in the shadows. And John McCain would have none of that, and he was very clear from the outset that Mark should be receiving credit. And in all of his public appearances in connection with the book, he's always gone out of his way to say that Mark really has done a tremendous amount of the work on these books.
Well, how much, that begs the question, how much does John McCain write of his books?
I think that it's very hard to know where John McCain ends and Mark Salter begins. I think that Mark does the first drafts, but he does them in consultation with McCain. He does them based on conversations with him. And the other thing you have to remember, and this is why I was talking about what an unusual collaboration it is, they've been together for 20 years. So Mark has been listening to all of McCain's stories, and he's been absorbing his way of thinking. And I think that when Robert Kaiser was describing their mind meld, it was quite an apt term to describe the two of them, because I honestly couldn't tell you who's writing what or where the ideas are coming from. I don't know. But I would have to think that certainly the life story is McCain's, and Mark has a real gift for storytelling, and I think that the raw power of the story plus McCain's integrity and his beliefs, I think that it all comes together.
Well, let's show our audience the books. We're going to put the phone numbers up also if you want to participate in this conversation. Jonathan Karp has been John McCain's editor since 1998, 1999. If you want to talk about some of John McCain's books, some of what he writes about in his books, this is a good time to call in. And booktv@cspan.org is the email address. Here is Why Courage Matters. This is a small paperback, The Way to a Braver Life. What is this about?
Why Courage Matters, actually, in the wake of 9/11, I called them up and I said, I really would like the two of you to write a book about courage. It seemed to me to be a time when a lot of people were afraid, and McCain seemed like a singular figure in the culture to perhaps buck us up a little bit. So that's why I asked them to write that. And it's a book about, as the subtitle says, the way to a braver life. And I think that they talk about a lot of different people in the book. One of my favorite characters in the book is a woman named Hannah Sinesh, who I had not really known anything about. She was a commando. She was in the commando unit of the Haganah. She was a Hungarian Jew who returned from Palestine to save other Jews during Nazi occupation, and was willing to die for that, and in fact did die. They use her and many other people as examples of courage. One of the interesting things about that book, actually, is that they think that courage has been defined down. They talk about how Daniel Patrick Moynihan had written that deviancy had been defined down. Courage has been defined down in our culture, and now perfectly admirable things like telling the truth or a brave athletic, a gutsy athletic act are considered courageous. But to them, courage is putting your life on the line for a greater purpose.
Character is destiny.
Character is destiny. Well, it was interesting. Why Courage Matters did so well that we went back to them for another book about virtues intended principally for children. If you want to loosely think of Why Courage Matters as a self-help book, we thought that it might be fun to have John McCain and Mark Salter write a kind of a children's book. So this would be a book that parents would read to their children and discuss virtues. So they wrote about 40 people. Each person exemplifies a certain virtue. And it was phenomenally successful. It's very interesting. I mean, we wouldn't have kept publishing these books if there weren't actual demand for them. And the funny thing is, I don't think John McCain has ever asked us to publish one of his books, or asked anybody to publish one of his books. The first one, a literary agent approached him about, and the last four, I've begged him and Mark to write.
And including Hard Call?
Hard Call is about the art of great decisions. And I asked them to write that a few years ago. It was clear that McCain was among the possibilities for the presidency, and I thought that it would be very worthwhile to have a book about how a potential president thinks about decision making. And again, the structure of the book is using examples of other people. So his own decisions are in there, and as is typical of McCain, some of his own decisions are his bad decisions because he's a self-deprecating man, and he begins with his rather unfortunate decision not to evade an attack while flying over Hanoi, and how that's an example of bad situational awareness. He says that there are six basic qualities in making good decisions: awareness, confidence, humility, timeliness, inspiration, and foresight.
Is this similar to, or is it kind of akin to Profiles in Courage?
Actually not, because Profiles in Courage is set in the U.S. government, and Hard Call is about all kinds of decisions that people made in business, in science, in sports. One of my favorite stories is about Branch Rickey's decision to integrate the Brooklyn Dodgers, and how that took a lot of awareness in terms of dealing with the front office and dealing with fans and finding the right player. There's a story about doctor, a surgeon named Judah Folkman, who for 30 years pursued a cancer treatment against the advice and judgment of all of his peers virtually.
When you write a book like this, and you're potentially running for president, are you a little more careful about the people you pick?
I think that I think that's a perfectly valid question. I don't think that it's that hard to find people who are exemplary, so it's probably not that much of an issue. The thing about all these books, interestingly enough, is they're all basically inspirational. And that's why I kept working with them, because I really felt like these books were having a positive impact on the lives of readers. And I would see it at the book signings. People would come by and they would often, I was surprised by how often people would thank McCain for his service. And I don't know why I should be surprised by that, but it was something that would happen again and again. But they would say that the books really were helping them serve a cause greater than their own self-interest, as Senator McCain has basically been saying for the last 30 years.
We're going to take some calls, and then we're going to get into, is it fair to call this a two-part autobiography?
I think you could do that.
Faith of My Fathers, followed by Worth the Fighting For. We'll talk about these two main books of John McCain. Let's take some calls, though, for Jonathan Karp, Providence, Rhode Island. You're on the air.
Yes, Mr. Karp, I have two comments and a question. First, there has been a good amount of criticism and documentation from senators on both sides of the aisle regarding Senator McCain's explosive temper. So I do have concerns about whether McCain's temperament is suitable for commander-in-chief. My second comment is, way before the primaries began, I remember McCain saying he would not play up his military background, and I respected his decision not to do so. Like many Americans, I have a long family history of military service, going back to World War I, my father was in World War II, and my brother lost a leg in Vietnam. And the one thing most veterans have in common is they rarely talk or brag about their suffering during wartime. But all I've heard from McCain and his surrogates is how he has suffered through 4 years of hell as a prisoner of war. So my question is, no disrespect, but McCain says he is a man of honor. But doesn't his political exploitation of his war record and breaking his promise not to do so prove otherwise?
Thank you for your call. I think that John McCain is certainly the most honorable man I've met, and I'm not here as a surrogate for him, though. I'm here as his book publisher and his editor, his longtime editor. I can tell you, with regard to your first question, that he talks about his anger in his in both of the first two books, and he believes that he was intemperate early in his Senate career, and he says that he hopes he's gotten better at that. He describes himself as a work in progress, even in his most recent book. He thinks there's a difference between anger and outrage, and he says that there are certain things that should outrage public servants, and when the public good is not being served, it's his job to get angry and to show some outrage, and he thinks he's doing his job, and that if he ever fails to do that, he should probably retire.
Jonathan Karp, was it hard to get John McCain to talk about his Vietnam experience?
Well, it was. I understand that he actually doesn't like to talk about it very much, and I think that he probably is responding more so than anything else to the needs of the campaign and questions that he's continually asked about it. But I don't really want to insert myself into that. I mean, certainly, the thing about Faith of My Fathers, you have to understand, is that although it ends, the third part of the book ends with his experience at war, and a lot of people do think that it's the most powerful part of the book. It's largely about his grandfather and his father and the influence that they had on him, and how something, if I can, sure. There's a line from the book that sort of encapsulates it. A filthy, crippled, broken man, all I had left of my dignity was the faith of my fathers. It was enough. And I think that it's all part of a piece. I think that he fell in love with his country in Vietnam, as he said, in that prison camp. And I don't think he could describe the love that he has for his country or the purpose that he feels today without talking about this. I think it's all of a piece.
A couple of quotes from Faith of My Fathers. The beatings were of short duration because I let out a hair-raising scream whenever they occurred. My interrogators appeared concerned that hospital personnel might object. I also suspected that my treatment was less harsh than might be accorded other prisoners. This I attributed to my father's position and the propaganda value the Vietnamese placed on possessing me, injured but alive. Later, my suspicion was confirmed when I heard accounts of other POWs' experiences during their first interrogations. They had endured far worse than I had and had withstood the cruelest torture imaginable. And to just go on, many guys broke at one time or another. I doubt anyone ever gets over it entirely. There is never enough time and distance between the past and the present to allow one to forget his shame. I am recovered now from that period of intense despair when he was broke, but I can summon up its feelings in an instant whenever I let myself remember the day, and I still wince when I recall wondering if my father had heard of my disgrace. The Vietnamese had broken the prisoner they called the Crown Prince, and I knew they had done it to hurt the man they believed to be king.
Right. Actually, I remember when we were editing the book, he was even more self-flagellating. And he went on about the shame that he felt. And it was a little hard for me as a reader to understand how that shame could be so great, knowing the torture he'd already experienced. And we actually, that's one of the when people ask me what kind of editing did you do of this book, it was actually one of the few things I asked them to cut back was the, were the descriptions of the shame he felt. And he really couldn't forgive himself. And I believe that, I think on page 241 there's a description of how he sort of attempted suicide. But it was in the context, it was sort of a half-hearted attempt, I think is how he describes it. And it was done mostly to show his captors that he would rather die than break. And that they weren't going to get anything out of him. So he just showed tremendous fortitude, I think.
Next call for Jonathan Karp, Washington, D.C. You're on the air.
Good morning. I have been keeping up with every level of C-SPAN and the EIB network and everything that you can imagine to make a decision that will be life-altering for my life. I'm 22 years old, and I'm contemplating going in the United States military. Here's my issue. My concern is that I really like John McCain because he broke with the Republican Party, but at the same time, I thought, based on everybody saying he's the oldest Republican to ever be nominated as president for the party, and then choosing Sarah Palin in regard to, I think, like a backdraft towards Hillary Clinton not being selected and or vetted for Barack Obama. So I'm in the middle of these contemplations, but I was more so worried about the 100-Year War, and he's saying at the convention that he would know when to go to war and when to not. And so I'm just real curious, especially because he had the senator from Connecticut, Joe Lieberman, speak on behalf, who's supposed to, like I am, be an independent, but spoke primarily for the Republican. Then I read in the paper that he pretty much votes with the Democrats. Here's my issue in question, is that if we have a commander-in-chief, based on what I just heard you read, and me being a person who wants to have a life legacy career, like Sarah Palin did say, his career speaks for itself, and wanting to be someone who would pretty much stomp in those type of footsteps, I was real concerned that he didn't choose Jeb Bush. I mean, I know we're having these Clinton dynasty.
Caller, can you finish this up very quickly, please?
Say it again, please.
Could you finish this up very quickly?
Well, I'm just getting to the point that
right.
I'm curious. Well, here's my point. Rick Warren was on Sean Hannity the day after the debate, and I'm fair-minded. I try to stay
Caller, do you have a specific question for our guest?
What does he think McCain-Palin presidency would separate itself from a Bush-Cheney presidency.
Thank you. Jonathan Karp, as John McCain's editor, is there anything in that gentleman's statement in question that you would like to respond to?
I wish you all the best. I can't really handle any of that.
Okay. When it comes to John McCain's writings, can we glean from this his positions on issues?
Absolutely, yes. And it's interesting because I was looking at Hard Call, and there was something that was written in here that has been sort of overlooked. And I think it's interesting because this book was written well before the race began. It was published in 2005. And it's about actually McCain's views on education and change. And the reason why it's so interesting to me is he had no idea that this would be all about change, this election. And he also didn't know that he'd be running against Barack Obama. And if I can just find this here, it would be really interesting for you to hear this because nobody has focused on this yet. If you could just give me a second.
Well, we'll let you look that up. I will remind our viewers that Jonathan Karp is the editor. He's also publisher of 12, which is a new imprint, or an imprint owned by Hachette. He's worked with John McCain as his editor. He is a supporter of John McCain. However, he is not a policy person or here as an advocate for John McCain at all. He's here to talk about John McCain's books. So I would simply remind our viewers of that. If you have questions about John McCain's writings or anything, this is Book TV. Did you find it?
I did, yes. If there's any endeavor in our country, if any endeavor in our country is in need of innovation and leaders with foresight, it is education. The institutional obstacles to systemic change are immense. And then he goes on to say, people outside the system might find it easier to grasp the problem and perceive the remedies, but the impediments within the system are so averse to change that the most effective agent of change, the person who understands the reality and forces progress toward a new ideal, will have to come from within. So it's basically an argument for change from within, which I thought was interesting in the context of this. And I should say that I'm a supporter of John McCain and Mark Salter's books, but I really am here to talk about the books, and, and my own personal views are not relevant.
Right. I can't see that next call, so we're going to move on to Mountain Home, Idaho. Idaho, you are on with Jonathan Karp.
Hello, yes. I have some information. A website, veterancourtcodes.com, says in 1981 that Joe Biden and John McCain met veterans in the New Jersey Federal Building and learned that veteran benefits were being stolen through a court code system, and that in the past 40 years, $20 to $50 billion have been stolen. Now, Biden and McCain have not produced any legislation. In all of your editing of his books, have you heard anything about this? Because the anti-veteran protest that was just at the RNC makes me wonder if this is a story that's been hidden or no one wants to talk about it.
Thank you, caller.
Let me say that I appreciate the interest in all of the issues surrounding this campaign, but really the books were intended to be apolitical and nonpartisan, and actually going back to McCain's very earliest statements before he began to run, he does value practical solutions over partisan ideology, and the books are expressly apolitical.
You've read all his books. You know John McCain.
Several times.
What did how did his imprisonment change his life?
Well, he fell in love with this country. I think I said that, but I think it made him realize, I mean, I'm not going to tell you anything that hasn't been said by dozens of other people here. I've never talked to him about it personally.
But what can you glean from his writings?
Well, what I can glean from his writings is that it made him a much more focused individual. He writes in Worth the Fighting For that a rebel without a cause is just a punk. And he began to realize that serving a cause greater than your own self-interest is the most redeeming thing that you can do. And I think that the part of his, the leitmotif in all of these books is that public service is the most noble thing you can do. And it doesn't have to be military service. It can be anything.
From Worth the Fighting For. As a politician, I am instinctive, often impulsive, and quick at recognizing and seizing opportunities. I don't torture myself over decisions. I make them as quickly as I can, quicker than the other fellow if I can. Often, my haste is a mistake, but I live with the consequences without complaint.
That's right. I underlined the same part, and I thought that was interesting. And it was an example of just how candid how candid he's been in these books. I mean, I think in Worth the Fighting For, I think he begins it by saying, were I to catalog all my faults, they would be the length of this book. So he likes to put it out there. I mean, here's an interesting insight into the man, at least I think is interesting. He, in Character is Destiny, he writes about his father and his mother. And his mother, well, first of all, let me tell you a funny story about his father. His father was frequently seen with both his wife, and his wife had an identical twin sister. And his father was asked, how do you tell them apart? And his father would say, well, that's really their problem. But anyway, in Character is Destiny, his mother was playing cards with his father. And just teasingly, his mother accused his father of cheating at the card game. And as McCain describes it, his father shot up from the table and begged her, and that was the word, the verb was begged her never to even jokingly accuse him of lying or cheating again. And he says in his books that his father was the most honest man he knew. And I don't think I had realized until rereading these books just how significant that might be. I think that, everybody talks about how candid McCain is, and obviously straight talk has become a phrase that he has used to identify his own campaign. But I think that the roots of that straight talk and that honesty are deep and visceral. And I think that all relates to the tone of these books.
And in Worth the Fighting For, in the Keating 5 chapter, this is what John McCain writes. I do not like to have my courage questioned. I have a tendency to overreact to any suggestion that my cautiousness when deciding whether or not I will become involved in a matter betrays cowardice rather than concern for the propriety of my actions. And however well-founded that concern, it will probably seem slightly less important to me at the time than a strong defense of my courage, which I will usually express in words and manner little change from the reactions to such provocations I had as a schoolboy. This is, I admit, an immature and unprofessional reaction to slights, which are, of course, an experience common to politicians. But in this instance, however, I am glad that I never quite succeeded in controlling my bad habit.
Right. I think he knows who he is.
When it came to writing the chapter on the Keating 5, did you have to encourage John McCain to give it all, or did you have to pull back?
Oh, to the contrary. This was, again, typical of the man's principle. The original chapter, the chapter in the book is 45 pages. The original chapter was probably twice that length, and Mark Salter worked heroically to get it down. I was really worried we were going to wind up reading an entire book about the Keating 5, because it was the lowest point of his public career. And I do think that there is something there. The reason why it is a central chapter of the book, and why it deserves to be, and actually why in this context it's quite important, is you can use the Keating 5 story as an example of his chastening and his growing awareness of just how the perception of misdeeds can be bad enough in itself. But I also think, the larger lesson that he learned from the Keating 5 was just how partisanship can be so destructive. And we should also talk about John Tower in that context. We should come back to that, because both of those stories, I think, illustrate McCain's frustration. I mean, actually, he was the only Republican member of the Keating Five, and he was cleared of any impropriety, but he was left hanging by the investigative Senate committee because they didn't want to let the only Republican on the committee off. And at one point he went to Warren Rudman and he said, look, I don't care what you do, shoot me if you have to, but just end this. And I think that it was, for him, it was such an assault on his honor and on his integrity. And he knew he had done nothing wrong. I mean, what he has said subsequently is what he did wrong was just go to the meetings. Even the perception of meeting with loan regulators was a mistake. And he wasn't seeking exoneration. He was merely, but he was, I believe, and it's pretty clear from the book, this was an assault on his integrity. And it went on much longer than it needed to, largely for partisan reasons.
Cleveland, thanks for holding. You're on with John McCain's editor, Jonathan Karp.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Please go ahead. Yes.
I'm interested in the book. I'm interested in what's in it and what's not in it, and the stock by which Mr. McCain comes from. I've been doing a bit of research, and I found that McCain's grandfather, great-grandfather, owned slaves. And I'm wondering if that shaped his view up until the time when he voted against Martin Luther King's Day in Arizona, and if the book really brings in the history of his family.
Thank you, caller.
Yes, he does say in Faith of My Fathers that his forebears fought on the side of the Confederacy. And he also says in Worth the Fighting For, one of the other low points of his political career was when he was campaigning for president in 2000. He was in South Carolina and he was asked to take a position on whether or not the Confederate flag should fly above the state capitol. And at the time, he dodged the issue. In fact, I've got the statement here. I think he said something like he would actually pull out the prepared statement that his campaign had read for him, and he would read it as if it was a hostage statement. And every time he was asked a question, he'd pull out the paper and he'd go through this elaborately theatrical ritual of reading it because he knew that it was wrong. And he found he personally was opposed to the Confederate flag being flown there, but he didn't want to say it for political reasons. After the campaign ended, he went back to South Carolina and he apologized. So that's the extent to which he's dealt with race. I mean, I don't think that I've ever heard him asked about having relatives who own slaves, and I don't know the answer to that question.
Sarasota, Florida.
Hello. Yes. I'm interested in generally your experience with politicians and politically minded people, and John McCain seems to be less guilty of this than almost everybody else who spoke. Why is it in general that Republicans seem to be a lot more interested in ridicule and sarcasm and mocking than do Democrats? Why is that?
Well, let's take it from a John McCain, what you know about John McCain and attack politics.
Well, John McCain has a great sense of humor, and sometimes the humor is directed at himself, and sometimes it's directed outwardly. I don't have any opinion about the tone of the Republican Party. I can tell you that I've worked with a lot of politicians. I've worked with Paul Wellstone on a book I really admired called The Conscience of a Liberal. I'm working with Congressman Henry Waxman right now on a book called The Waxman Report. I'm working with Senator Edward Kennedy on his memoir, and I worked with Gary Hart on a book about why reform doesn't happen. And I have great admiration for all of these men. I don't think that I really try to stay out of the ideological distinctions.
Right, but when it comes to John McCain, does he attack anyone in his books? Does he go after somebody? Who does he go after?
Well, okay. Well, he doesn't attack him personally. He doesn't, but he does attack the behavior of Sam Nunn in Worth the Fighting For. He believes that the word that he used was inexcusable in depicting Sam Nunn's behavior, his decision, Senator Nunn's decision, to allow the members of the committee in charge of the confirmation of John Tower. He allowed all members of the committee to read the raw FBI file on John Tower. And as a result, a lot of innuendo about John Tower's private life became a source of public conversation and were, in McCain's view, an assault to Senator Tower's integrity and were the defamation of a very, very good man, a man who he believed deserved to be the Secretary of Defense. So in that regard, I mean, he knew exactly what he was writing when he said that Senator Nunn's behavior was inexcusable. Now, is that a personal attack? I don't think so. I think it's criticism.
Next call for Jonathan Karp, Riverside, California. Riverside.
Hi, good morning.
Please go ahead.
I won't be too hard on you. I'm a Christian, Christian Democrat. What I was wondering is, you know, I like John McCain, and I think he has a great history and a great person. I just, you know, wish he hadn't made a couple comments like bomb, 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 bomb Iran, and, you know, it's just, you know, there's real bodies over there and people. And the one thing I was wondering if he mentioned it all in his book, these detention camps across America and the oppression of protesters. Now it seems like there's a direction toward putting us like slaves or something like that. I was just wondering how he would stand, how you think, or if he said in his book how he would use something like that, the treatment of, like, you know, if somebody wants to protest, let them protest. And Presidential Directive 51, if you know that, what that is, if maybe that might come into play.
Well, one of the recurring characters in all of these books, oddly enough, is a Burmese dissident named Aung San Suu Kyi. Did I get that right? She is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate and has made great personal sacrifice for freedom in Burma. I think that McCain, and there are other people throughout these books who McCain talks about in similar tones of admiration. He admires anybody who is trying to further the cause of freedom and democracy.
And in fact, this is what he says about Ronald Reagan, and who makes a recurring appearance in his books. No one had a more pronounced influence on my political convictions than Ronald Reagan. I embraced all of the core Reagan convictions: faith in the individual, skepticism of government, free trade and vigorous capitalism, anti-communism, a strong defense, robust internationalism that championed our values abroad, and most important, his eloquently stated belief in America's national greatness, his trust in our historical exceptionalism, the shining city on the hill he invokes so often, in which I heard the echoes of my great political hero, Teddy Roosevelt.
Right, and Roosevelt is another one of those heroes. I think it's interesting that, you know, we've all heard Senator McCain refer to himself as a foot soldier in the Reagan Revolution. I've often wondered, you know, just exactly, you know, what a foot soldier looks like. But I do believe that his support of Reagan and Reagan's principles are sincere, and they're in all the books.
What's it like to work with John McCain?
It's been inspiring. Truly inspiring, and I meant what I said earlier. He's probably the most honorable man I've had the privilege of editing. It's been a 10-year relationship. I work principally with Mark Salter, so I'm around when Senator McCain is promoting the books, but I give most of my editorial notes to Mark.
Next call for Jonathan Karp comes from Gainesville, Florida.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Hi.
And Mr. Karp, I am a Vietnam veteran in combat. I got out in 1971 from Valley Forge Army Hospital. I've been dying to know something for the last 38 years. Well, the thing that really got to me was after so many years, we were ostracized. We first got out by the left as and condemned as baby killers. And then when Senator Kerry ran, all of a sudden Vietnam veterans were the greatest thing that ever happened. But that is, my question is this: what was Senator McCain's reaction as when he was in prison to and the NVA reaction to the Jane Fonda, Tom Hayden visit to Vietnam? What was the reaction of his captors and the reaction of the prisoners? Thank you.
Does John McCain write about Jane Fonda's visit to Hanoi?
To the best of my knowledge, I don't think he's addressed that in any of the books. I certainly don't remember it. He talks generally about what he felt in the prison camp at the time, which was that they thought that the war had been mismanaged, and I think that, and he then went. But he has said that he was basically locked in time, frozen in amber, and so when he got out, he went to National War College and he read everything he could about Vietnam, and including the entire Pentagon Papers. This isn't in the book. I've seen him talk about this. In the books, his criticism is largely the way the war was managed. He thinks that the civilian leaders made bad decisions, and that they didn't listen to what they were hearing. And interestingly enough, his own father, as you know, was commanding the Pacific, and his father would try to get advice to the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff through back channels. And his own father was critical of the way Vietnam was being executed, and that is in the book. And I think that that's interesting in light of what's been happening in Iraq.
It's not hard to understand now that, given the prevailing political judgments of the time, the Vietnam War was better left unfought. No other national endeavor requires as much unshakable resolve as war. If the government and the nation lack that resolve, it is criminal to expect men in the field to carry it alone. John McCain and Mark Salter, Faith of My Fathers. Tucson, Arizona, you're on with Jonathan Karp.
Yes, hi. I have a comment that I need to state before I ask the question, or my question won't make sense. So, and this is in response to the lady that called in a few calls back that said she comes from several generations of soldiers and heroes and was disappointed in John McCain because apparently he promised not to talk about his war experience during the campaign. And now he is, and now she's disappointed. I also come from several generations of brave soldiers and warriors. My father has a Purple Heart from the Second World War. My husband is a wonderful Vietnam veteran. And I have watched John McCain finally come out of the closet, so to speak, on his war experience and what an incredible soldier and warrior he was. And I sit here in my living room and watch my husband cry with tears of relief that it's finally okay to talk about it. And I do not believe he's the only soldier and warrior that has lived in silence. And I will tell you, as a wife of one of these soldiers, they are not talking because they have some honor code. They are not talking because they can't, because it's painful. And we, people like this lady, find it disdainful because they can't cope. And my question, as I preface that, to Jonathan is John McCain coming out and finally standing honorable in his country and speaking about what a brave warrior he is and was and will always be?
Thank you.
Well, you know, I think that's a very good question, and it reminds me of a passage in Why Courage Matters. One of the final stories in the book is about Mark Salter's father, who was fighting in Korea and had to kill a couple of people in Korea. And Mark's father never talked about it, or rarely. He would just utter a few words about it. Every November 5th, he would take a vow of silence, basically, to commemorate this day, and drink a bottle of scotch, I think. And I think it is hard for people to talk about it. I don't think that John McCain, you know, it's funny because the previous caller who was raising this question, when that question came up, I was thinking about how Bob Dole, when he ran for president, it was said that he had trouble talking about his war experience, and maybe this is just something that you don't do, that there's kind of a natural reticence about it. But I really can't speak to it. It's not something I've ever discussed with Senator McCain.
Atlanta. Good afternoon. You're on Book TV.
Glad I got on just after that caller there. I'm a veteran, and I agree with the first caller and to the woman that just got off. The issue that we're complaining about, and I'm complaining about, he's trying to use his POW status every time as a political ploy. Now, when he talks, he says he'd rather lose an election than lose a war. But yet, every time he gets in trouble, he tries to fall back on his POW status. Now, I've got a question, but first of all, getting back to character, you know, you go back, and I hope the book talks about it because that's where my question's going. He got into the Naval Academy not because of his grades, but because of the status of his father and grandfather as being admirals. You know, you go back and you look at the history of what he was like in the Naval Academy. He was a party animal. He was a hothead. And then when he got out of the Naval Academy, he crashed 2 planes. I hope that's in the book, where he crashed one in 1959 in off the coast of Texas, and he almost drowned. And then he crashed one up by Norfolk, and then he flew one into power lines.
All right, so
now my
what's your
question, do you have his, because his high school grades and SAT scores are secret, do you know what they are, number one? Number two,
okay, let's leave it there. We got the point, caller. In fact, does John McCain write about his education at the Naval Academy, and how brutally honest is he about it?
He actually, in a couple of the books, he talks about it, and he's definitely very candid about having graduated 5th from the bottom of his class. And you know, the thing that you have to understand about storytelling is that all good stories are about transformation. And I think one of the reasons why the McCain story is so compelling is because it is a transformation story. I mean, he was a callous youth. I mean, he said his classmates accused him of being spoiled. And it's all in the book, and the point is that he became a better person. I think that that's the transformation. He talks about not being a particularly effective pilot, and so it's not that I think he's using the POW story to milk it so much as the fact that it's simply his story.
And in fact, this is what he writes: "In faith of my fathers, in this well-ordered, timeless world with its lofty aspirations and grim determination to make leaders and gentlemen of schoolboys, plebes who possessed minor eccentricities might be tolerated somewhat, but arrogant nonconformists encountered open hostility. Recognized as belonging in the latter category, I soon found myself in conflict with the Academy's authorities and traditions. Instead of beginning a crash course in self-improvement so that I could find a respectable place in the ranks, I reverted to form and embarked on a 4-year course of insubordination and rebellion."
Right.
That caller also asked his high school records. Does he discuss his high school grades in his writings?
Well, it says that he obviously developed a great love of literature. I mean, the short answer is no. He doesn't talk about high school grades, but there are some really wonderful stories about a teacher he had, a guy by the name of Ravenel, and that's in, I think it's in Character is Destiny, at the end of that book. And he talks about how this teacher helped him, actually I'm sorry, it's in Hard Call, and it's about how this teacher helped him make some decisions. There was he was on the football team, and one of the players had broken training, and they had to decide whether to kick him off or whether to punish him, and it was their decision. And McCain became the leader of the group that said he shouldn't be kicked off the team because he never actually signed the code saying that he would behave, and because he knew he might not, and also he'd already been punished enough. And McCain viewed that experience as being something he always thought about, you know, in making subsequent decisions. It's sort of like a first crucible, I think. But you know, this is apropos of nothing. But if your caller if you're interested in his intelligence, I believe Time magazine reported that his IQ was 130. Whether you want to believe in IQ tests, I will leave to you.
And one more writing from this again is from Faith. There were times in my youth when I harbored a secret resentment that my life's course seemed so preordained. I often wondered if my father had ever felt the same way. Neither of us ever misbehaved by design or purposely threw some insurmountable obstacle in the path of our expected naval careers. Our antics were much more spontaneous than that, but did he, like me, occasionally speculate that his troublemaking might disrupt his family's plans for him? And was he as surprised as I was to discover that the thought did not fill him with dread? Boston, you're on with Jonathan Karp.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I'm not surprised you glossed over the Keating 5 episode. There are some reports that say he took over 120,000 in bribes, campaign contributions. And then there's also the story that you seem to be omitting about his first wife, Carol Shep, how this family man, McCain, dumped her because she was all busted up and she wasn't as glamorous because of a car accident. And I'm sure you're aware.
Does he gloss over the Keating 5, and does he discuss his divorce in his writings?
He definitely discusses the divorce. He says it's his greatest moral failing, not unlike what he said actually at that Saddleback meeting with Rick Warren. So it's in the book, and he says about as much as as anybody would really want to read, I think.
What's your reaction to the fact that both presidential candidates have bestsellers, multiple bestsellers, and seem relatively pretty frank in their writing styles? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with that, and I think it's interesting. And I hope that, in a way, it is going to continue to be this way. I think that we have two tremendously candid, talented, intelligent, well-read, literary people running for president, and it's a great choice we have this year.
And with regard to the Keating 5, John McCain was on book tour, and we covered him, Book TV covered him, and here's what he was saying about the Keating 5 issue.
You write, we now arrive at the point in this narrative that chronicles my nearly inextricable and disastrous involvement in what came to be known as one of the greatest financial calamities in American history. $2,000 for every man, woman, and child in the USA was the cost to the government to pay back the depositors. Just briefly, what happened, and what about those two meetings that you are forever going to regret, you say?
Well, what happened was we got into a situation where with taxpayers' dollars, people were engaging in sham transactions. They were extending loans which were absolutely bogus, and they were cooking the books. I mean, and it all came, as these things do, it came tumbling down. And one of the major players was Lincoln Savings and Loan, which was a outfit that Charles Keating bought which was a very small savings and loan, and then he made it into this huge money lending. But what happened was the entire S&L industry collapsed, and the taxpayers had to bail it out, and that was where it went $2,000 per person. It was a huge disaster.
It had not been profitable for several years. The year that he bought it, it had just made a $3 million profit, and the next year it made an $80 million profit.
Wasn't that incredible?
Wow, wasn't he clever? Maybe that was a red flag. You said in the book that you never doubted what his interest was in you. You and your families were good friends, and you liked him, and he liked you, and you didn't see that perhaps he was playing you as a political tool that he would need down the road. And he did call in that chip. You're a guy with good political instincts, but you didn't see this coming.
Oh no, I really don't think anybody did. But that's where I came into play. Was that he asked me to help him. I said I wouldn't do certain things. He called me a wimp. I threw him out of my office, but then I still went to a meeting with 4 other senators who were the group of regulators. Now look, what I said on paper was fine. I said, I'm not here for any special favors, But the fact was, there was 5 senators there meeting with regulators who directly regulated an industry, an individual that was a supporter of mine. And the appearance, no matter what I said, if I had recited the Koran, it didn't matter. The fact is that I was at that meeting, and that created an appearance of impropriety for which I paid a very heavy price.
Jonathan Karp, has John McCain ever gotten mad at you?
You know something? He's never gotten mad at me. I've never seen him show even a slight twinge of anger, and the only time I thought he might have even been disapproving was when I was trying to get him to decide on a title of a book, and he just wasn't ready to, and he sort of smiled at me and said, we've got time. But no, actually, to me, he's been great.
Who suggested Faith of My Fathers?
That came from them.
And what does it mean?
I believe it's a hymn. I think that it's an Episcopal hymn.
Okay. What about Worth Dying For? Worth the Fighting For?
Worth the Fighting For. Well, actually, that is a quote from Ernest Hemingway. It's from For Whom the Bell Tolls. And I think that the line is, the world is a fine place and worth the fighting for, and I hate very much to leave it. And it was what Robert Jordan, I guess, says at the end of the book. Jordan is one of McCain's heroes. Worth the Fighting For. Actually, although it is an autobiography, what's interesting about it is that interspersed within McCain's life story are the stories of the people who inspired him the most. And Robert Jordan is a fictional character, but he had a tremendous influence on McCain. McCain read the book as a young man, and it inspired him in some way. The other people in the book are Teddy Roosevelt, Ted Williams, Morris Udall, Barry Goldwater, and I think most interestingly to me, Billy Mitchell, who I didn't know anything about until I read this, and he's really the father of the Air Force. And what's interesting about him is he was so rebellious and so determined to convince the public of the need for air power that he basically self-destructed to do it. He accused the Department of War and the Navy of basic negligence and incompetence in not developing air power, and as a result of those statements, he was court-martialed. McCain uses Billy Mitchell as an example of a man who, first of all, had great foresight, but secondly, as a man who was willing to put the needs of the country ahead of the needs of his own service. And also his own personal good. It's a great story.
John McCain writes that he came to Arizona and that Barry Goldwater didn't like him very much.
Right. He thinks
explain why?
He said Barry Goldwater, well, by the end, Barry Goldwater did like him, although he liked Cindy McCain a lot more. I think McCain says in the book that a beautiful woman, to the end, is always going to get you over the edge. But I think that Goldwater, he thought, might have viewed him as an upstart, maybe not worthy of the job yet, maybe a young man in too much of a hurry.
And from Worth the Fighting For, in truth, if you will pardon the vulgarity, I was becoming pissed off by the carpetbagger label, and my temper was getting the better of my judgment, as it often has. I felt that my family's service in the Navy and my own, which had deprived me of the comforts of a hometown, entitled me to choose any place in the country to live, and no one had good cause to question my decision.
That's right. I love the stories in that book about how he began his way in Arizona politics. He first sought the support of a man named Herb Drinkwater, who was a very popular mayor, and responded to all of his constituents with great equanimity. And in fact, the story is told that Drinkwater got a call at 2 in the morning from a constituent who wanted some information, and Drinkwater politely wrote down the question, and he got the answer, and he called the constituent back the next morning at 2 a.m. With the answer, and he said, "I knew you'd be up." So, there are stories like that. But he found his way in Arizona politics, and got involved in the Indian affairs because he thought that his constituents there would care about that, and then, of course, armed services.
Fayetteville, North Carolina, you're on with Jonathan Karp, who serves as John McCain's editor. Fayetteville.
Yes,
Please
this
go
is
ahead.
Marshall Goodman. I'm a Vietnam era vet. My father was a 22-year non-com, served during the Korean War and also during the Second World War, and I listened closely, very closely to the closings of both conventions, and I was amazed, and I dare you to play back Mr. McCain's closing comments. I lost count of the times he said fight, fight, fight. And our men have done that in the Middle East. We've lost over 4,700 lives and God knows how many maimed. We've displaced I don't know how many people. It was completely foolish to charge in to Iraq. Bush's own father told him that, and this malarkey about being independent is a lot of junk.
Thank you, caller. Got the point. Jonathan Karp.
Well, I'm not going to address the politics of it. I will say that purely in terms of language, fight is a concise one-syllable verb. It works well in political speeches. McCain does use the phrase in the books. Obviously, it's in the title of one of them, but I don't. You know, a lot of people do. It's John Edwards was using fight all the time. Hillary Clinton did. I mean, I think that it's just a word that comes up a lot.
Howard from Canton, Ohio emails in, I find age a poor and prejudiced proxy for competence. Too old and too young are equally offensive. Can Jonathan relate any anecdotes from his work with John McCain that can relate to his competence level with respect to his ability to think on his feet and his decision-making abilities?
Well, I heartily recommend that you read Hard Call if you want to know about John McCain's decision-making abilities, because it's a 400-page book all about decisions. I think that, you know, I think probably the right way to address that kind of a question is to just watch the person. I think he said something, interestingly enough, at the end of Worth the Fighting For, where he talks about how he's not sure whether he's going to run again, and I wrote it down because I thought it was it was something we actually argued about when we were working on the book, because I thought, you know, do you really want to say you're not going to run again? And that was what they both thought at the time. But he says, I doubt I'll have reason or opportunity to try again to become president. I guess what happened was 9/11, and I think he really did believe that he wanted to campaign for national security and to protect the country. I think that was what was the impetus there, but I don't know.
Did Cindy McCain have any input on his books?
I'm sure that she did, but not with me.
Kansas City, Missouri.
Hello there.
Hi.
First of all, I think both McCain and Obama are quite charismatic. The concern that I have, based upon the economic news that we're receiving at the moment, shows that it's a very difficult and complex time. We're challenged by some very serious economic issues. Some of the younger generations, such as, say, my son-in-law, has a depth in some of the financial fields that we never had when I was growing up. We know that Obama was magna cum laude at Harvard and taught at the University of Chicago. I would like to understand, in terms of John McCain, since he is closer to my age, what is his current depth of knowledge in econ and finance? Does he discuss his abilities at any point? Does he discuss his depth of experience in these areas? How well-read is he in these areas? And how does he approach these financial challenges? Can we intuit it by some of the decisions he's made in the past?
Thank you, caller.
I think that's a great question. I can talk only about his reading because we've talked about books. I know that he's read The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, all 6 volumes of it, twice. I know that he reads Somerset Maugham, obviously Hemingway. He reads voraciously and widely. The last time he was at our offices, I think he took a David Baldacci thriller. So he has a tremendous intellectual curiosity. That's not just my opinion. It's been reported everywhere. And I would imagine that it certainly extends to the economy. But it's not something that I've talked to him about specifically.
Does he write at all about economic conditions or the economy?
In Hard Call, he writes a lot about, he and Mark Salter write a lot about business decisions. It begins, one of the stories on timing begins with the story of Boeing and how, as chairman of the Commerce Committee, he was investigating wrongdoings at Boeing. He couldn't understand why they needed, why the military needed these tankers, these refueling, I don't know what they're called exactly, but they're planes to refuel.
Tankers.
Yeah. And they discovered malfeasance there. People were indicted as a result of this investigation. And McCain then uses that story to talk about a time when Boeing was a genuinely visionary company and how the CEO of the company was brave enough to order planes, larger planes than the company had ever made before, and produce them at a loss in order to save the company, in order to keep the employees of the company at work, and to maintain the viability of Boeing. So there are stories like that, business stories in Hard Call, and I think that they go to McCain's basic view, which is, as you've heard from his speeches, he's obviously a conservative Republican who is in favor of the entrepreneurial dynamism of the economy and giving people the freedom and opportunity to make their own success.
And Hard Call came out in 2007. Why, again, did this book come out?
It came out because I felt like there was a possibility that the man might be the next president of the United States, and we ought to understand what his decision-making process is. I would have asked any leading candidate to write the book that they wrote if I'd had the relationship with them, and also if I knew that the book was going to be as good as their books have been. I mean, because I've had this long relationship, I knew that any book that McCain and Salter wrote would be interesting. And at the risk of being repetitive, I want to say that there isn't very much that's political in these books. I mean, they're intentionally meant to be stories. And sometimes the stories are examples of where we need to go politically. But they're always first and foremost stories.
Next call for Jonathan Karp, St. Louis, Missouri. Hello, St. Louis.
Hello.
Please go ahead with your question.
Oh, I'm wondering if Jonathan knows if John McCain has read any of Barack Obama's books and what his opinions on his books were or are.
I read a profile in which McCain was asked that question. He said he hadn't read them. I'm not really sure whether that would be a productive use of his time at this point.
Have you read Barack Obama's books?
I have.
Would you, in an apolitical way, compare literary styles?
You know something?
In 15 seconds or less.
I thought actually, to be perfectly honest, I only read the first book and I thought it was really good.
Rockville, Georgia.
Yes. Okay, I have a question to ask him. I just want to know why John McCain did not identify himself as a disabled veteran and fight for the cause of disabled veterans.
Thank you, caller.
I don't know. I'm sorry.
Has he ever referred to himself in his writings as a disabled veteran?
No, not to my knowledge.
What is 12?
12 is a publishing imprint that publishes only 12 books a year. We publish one book a month, and the idea is to have great enthusiasm and passion for everything we do. And McCain's book, Hard Call, was one of our first 12, actually.
How did this book sell?
It was a New York Times bestseller. I actually have a story about it that's interesting. The book came out right when McCain's campaign was imploding. This came out in August of 2007, and if you'll remember, that was when they were having fundraising problems, and there was all the uproar in the Republican Party over his views on immigration. And it was really the worst possible time that a book could be published. And what was so striking to me about it was McCain just kept on keeping on. He came to New York to promote the book, and we met outside the Today Show studios, and it was just him and Mark Salter. He was literally carrying his own luggage in one of those roll-up suitcases. Went up to the Today Show. They sit him down, and they rolled the video introducing him, and it's a 4-minute reported story in which his campaign is declared dead by Charlie Cook, the political commentator. And then they cut to Matt Lauer interviewing John McCain, asking McCain, well, I suppose reports of your death are greatly exaggerated. And what was so wonderful about this is McCain was completely unconcerned about all of this. He said, it's supposed to be hard running for president. Everything's going to work out. It's going to be fine. And when the camera was off him, his expression and tone did not change at all. He was just as pacific and serene about the whole thing, and he was on to the next thing. And I watched him over that period several times, talking to interviewers for extended lengths of time. He was, I have to say, so self-possessed and confident that I could only think that this is how people would talk about leaders like Ronald Reagan. And I say that without any kind of ideological stake in the matter. But he really did seem like a man who knew who he was and what he wanted.
When it comes to promoting his work, what's it like to have John McCain as a client on the book trail?
He is, first of all, he hasn't kept any of the money for the books, and I think I should get that out there. So his promotion of the book is largely, I think, to promote the stories and ideas in the book, and I think it's all part of this larger piece of him, that he feels this is a way of maybe inspiring people to service. He's been very effective as an exponent of his work. I think that in the last year he's been a bit preoccupied with running for president, and he has not done very much for Hard Call at all. But that's okay. We're still very, very proud to be his publisher. I should also say that if you were to ask me what their greatest quality is as authors, it would be that in addition to being a remarkable writing team, every single book has been delivered on time. And,
is that a big deal?
Let them be an inspiration and a model to all authors in America. It does definitely help.
Next call for Jonathan Karp, Providence, Rhode Island.
Hello.
Hi.
I feel one's personal conduct reveals a person's true character, and it seems that I'd like to know if Mr. McCain only defines character in terms of military service and not in terms of fidelity and the keeping of a promise as one does in a marriage. And I'd also like to know if he ever mentioned whether or not he has a relationship with the children from his previous marriage.
His children, I believe, are mentioned in the first two books, and he certainly has a strong relationship with all of them. And I think he's even dedicated. I think he dedicated one of the books to all of his children.
All
I think
seven.
It was, yeah.
Right.
And in terms of character, I think that character is achieved in the course of a lifetime, and certainly his career in the Senate is unrelated to his war experience, and quite a lot of these books are about his experiences in the Senate.
The relationship of a sailor and his children is, in large part, a metaphysical one. We see much less of our fathers than do other children. Our fathers are often at sea, in peace and war. Our mothers run our households, pay the bills, and manage most of our upbringing. For long stretches of time, they are required to be mother and father. They move us from base to base. They see to our religious, educational, and emotional needs. They arbitrate our quarrels, discipline us, and keep us safe. It is no surprise, then, that the personalities of children who have grown up in the Navy often resemble those of their mothers more than those of their fathers.
It's interesting because he writes in the book that the father's absence was a kind of presence. And actually, John Meacham in Newsweek has a very interesting paragraph in his profile of McCain where he talks about how certain of our great presidents have been defined by absent fathers and others have been defined by present fathers. And he puts McCain in the category of a potential president who was defined by a present father. Because even though his father wasn't around very much, it's very clear that John S. McCain Jr. was a great influence on his life. And the grandfather as well. It was written of the grandfather, when there isn't anything to be done, he's the kind of fellow who does it. And these were men who he had great admiration for.
Ashburn, Virginia.
Hello.
Hi.
Before I ask the question I called about, but can I get a clarification regarding this low point on his campaign? What happened after that? How did he start getting the money that he needed to continue the campaign?
I don't know. I think things just got better.
Yeah, that's not his expertise, caller.
Okay, let me ask you. Sorry. What I called about was regarding the Vietnam War and the Iraq War. Both of them seem to have been based on wrong perceptions, and his position on the Iraq War seems to be more of an emotional response that's prompted from his sacrifices as a POW, and whereas his written statement that you've shown on Vietnam seems to be more from the conscious thinking part of his brain. But how would you comment on that?
I don't agree. I think that if you read McCain, you'll see that he is first and foremost a student of history, and military history especially. And I think that he's come to these positions because he believes in them. And when he talks about timetables, he once prefaced his comment by saying, if you read any military history at all, you'll see that that's not a recipe for victory. I'm not going to get into the rights or wrongs of his positions on Iraq. That's not my place. But I do think he's coming to them in an intellectual way. I also think that McCain approaches these matters without in an intellectually honest way.
Manhattan, good afternoon. You're on Book TV. Manhattan.
Hello, can you hear me?
Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, and again, thank you for C-SPAN. It's the best thing going in terms of popular media. At any rate, listen, this young man there, he seems like a nice, very bright guy, a little smug, and it sounds also like this is a puff piece for McCain because, just to talk about character, the insult to all of us, what he's done by putting a totally unqualified person up there for a possible situation where she would be president. I mean, this is outrageous. He voted lockstep with Bush 90% of the time.
So what's your question for Jonathan Karp, Senator McCain's editor?
This fellow's a warrior. It's endless wars with these people. They would go into Georgia or whatever. Okay, it's crazy stuff, and I just want to know. I mean, this young man there sounds like a neoconservative who is pushing the character issue on someone who really, we've had enough of this, haven't we?
Thank you, caller. Let me tell you why we invited Jonathan Karp here. Not to answer political questions, but this is Book TV. He's here to discuss how John McCain writes his books, what information we can glean from those books, and to tell us some backstories as he's done. So I don't think your question was a fair one to ask him. But we do appreciate your watching and calling in. when it comes to John McCain or other politicians that you've edited for, do you ever have to say to them, well, that seems a little bit puffy. Maybe we should be a little bit more fair about such and such issue? Such as, you know, they talk very nicely about themselves, but they don't give the whole story. Do you ever face that situation when editing politicians?
I think you face it a lot.
With anybody?
Yeah, you face it a lot with anybody, and that just comes with the territory. I mean, I understand what the caller's saying. I'm their editor. An editor's first job is to be an advocate for their author. And I was a little concerned that by coming on here I would cross a line. And I don't want to do that because I think that the books should speak for themselves, and I think who you vote for is your own personal decision. I have not yet had a single person come up to me and say, I've read all of Barack Obama's books and I've read all of John McCain's books and I'm voting for one of them because their book was better. But I do think that books are a way of illuminating insight into the character of the writer. And I also think that in McCain's case, the guy's got a great story to tell. So that's my purpose here. I am not a neocon, and I am not even a Republican. I just like to read.
Did you learn anything from John McCain's acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention? Was there anything in there new to you that you didn't know about him?
No. It was a really well-written speech, and I think that a lot of and actually I was surprised by how much Fred Thompson's speech was drawn from Faith of My Fathers. I think that they certainly are.
Were you surprised at the stripper story? At the dating of the stripper?
No, it's in Faith of My Fathers, and actually Marie the Flame of Florida is even more prominent in the book, and in fact he takes her to a party, and she gets a little bored with the conversation, so she starts filing her nails with a switchblade. That kind of put a lull in the conversation, and at that point they decided to leave. So,
how long did he date Marie the Flame of Florida?
Not long, but he looks back upon it as, I think, a time when he was young and carefree, and he says in the book something to the extent of, I remember those times with fondness.
What's your favorite John McCain book?
Well, my favorite, I have to say, my favorite is Hard Call, because I think it's the most relevant.
The newest and the one you're
that's the one that I
currently promoting.
Yes.
Is that why it's your favorite?
It's my favorite because I think the point of 12 was to start a national conversation, and this is a book about decision making, and it was timed with the election in mind. And all I would say is, you know, if like that caller, you're upset about where we wound up in Iraq, I mean, actually, that was on my mind when I asked them to write Hard Call, because I didn't really understand the decision-making process that went into Iraq. And I thought, well, okay, we've got a guy who might be president, and I happen to know him. Let's find out what his decision-making process is.
And that's kind of what inspired the book, in a sense?
Yes, but I like them all. You know, I really do think, I think that, you know, if you were to ask me the one that hasn't been read, that should be read right now, Hard Call, the one that is the most powerful, the one that I think is the classic that will endure, it's Faith of My Fathers. If you want the one that's going to explain the U.S. Senate the best, it's worth the fighting for. And if you want the one that's going to help you be a more courageous person, it's Why Courage Matters. And I apologize for the shameless promotion.
That was shameless. Does John McCain have another book in the works right now?
Well, I think he's a little preoccupied, so no.
But do you have another idea for him in the works right now?
I have a multitude of ideas.
If he wins, will you make sure that he's writing a book the day after he wins? Or if he loses, about the campaign? Is that one of your thoughts?
Well, I would like to publish everything that they write. I'd also like to publish everything that Mark Salter writes. I think Mark is an exceptional writer.
Has he written anything singularly?
No, he never has. So I think he's a major talent, and I think he's going to write a lot more books. He may wind up working in the White House, so I mean, and I say that without, I've never discussed it with him. I just assume they've been together for 20 years. But there are many books that they have yet to write. He likes to barbecue. I don't think I'm going to be doing a grill book with him, though. I think that, and I'm certainly not going to be doing Sarah Palin's Moose Burger cookbook. There are plenty of books he could write.
Not if you only have 12 books to do a year. Jonathan Karp is the editor-in-chief of 12, new imprint by Hachette. Thank you for, and he's also John McCain's editor, so thank you for being with us here on In Depth.
My pleasure. As
I mentioned at the beginning, this was an unusual In Depth. We wanted to look at the books of Barack Obama and John McCain through the eyes of a biographer and an editor. Next month on In Depth, a little unusual also. We're going to have Richard Norton Smith and Doug Brinkley, two presidential historians, American historians, on together to talk about history, presidential campaigns, presidential history. That's next month on In Depth. Thanks for being with us.
We offer you another chance to view In Depth with Jonathan Karp and John K. Wilson in its entirety next Saturday at 9 a.m. Eastern.
Up next, Jared Bernstein, senior fellow.
What he thinks White House justification, let's say, start with the, almost limiting, I don't know, I'm looking for a word here, our civil liberties, not to mention torture laws and everything. I'm talking about White House lawyers like David Addington, chief counsel to Cheney, excuse me, and other bunch of lawyers working behind the closed doors, secrecy, and coming up loopholes about around our Constitution and justifying that.
So, caller, what's your question?
Question is what your guests think about the current White House lawyers going around and, around the law. And
Mr. Wilson, do you have any response to that,
I think that's where Barack Obama's background as a constitutional law professor and his deep experience in that is so important, because you will have somebody in the Oval Office who actually understands the Constitution, who deeply believes in civil liberties and civil rights. And that's a fundamental contrast with what the Bush administration has done.
What in his background would influence how he feels about certain laws? Particularly what that caller was referring to.
Well, I think he's someone who's been very committed to the notion of civil rights in particular. And really the civil rights movement is something that had a deep influence on him. And it's the civil rights movement, frankly, that is the springboard in America for the civil liberties movement. That a lot of the ideas and the activism for civil liberties is an offshoot of the civil rights movement. And that's where I think Obama is so knowledgeable, that he has that background in civil rights and civil knowledge. He worked as a civil rights lawyer. He taught constitutional law. He understands these issues and is committed to these kind of values that you don't find in the current Bush administration.
From Audacity of Hope, I have to side with Justice Breyer's view of the Constitution, that it is not a static but rather living document and must be read in the context of an ever-changing world.
Yeah, and that's a standard interpretation of the Constitution, and you even see that even conservative judges, for example, in the past year, in trying to understand the Second Amendment dealing with gun rights, they have to understand it in the context of a society. It's not trying to understand things that happened in 1787. It's trying to apply the principles to a modern age, and that's what the concept of a living Constitution is.
Our next call comes from Miami. Good afternoon. You're on the air.
Yeah, one problem I have with Barack Obama is that he seems very vague. We don't see any old friends from Punahou. His college thesis is missing. There weren't many writings for his law review. And maybe you could enlighten us. One of his mentors when he was a young man was Frank Marshall Davis, and he's been described as a radical, even a communist, I think, in the 50s. But that's not my interest. Frank Marshall Davis also wrote an autobiography in '68, which was called Sex Rebel, and he admitted to bisexualism and sex with minors. And this is relevant. I know sex is not...
And what I start with is the story of my father passing away, killed in a car accident, a father that I did not know well, somebody who had been part of that first generation of Africans to study in the United States, and then had married an American woman, had a child, but then had gone back to his own country, thinking that somehow he would be able to bring back technology and transformation through the knowledge that he had gained to help develop a country that was newly free. And I didn't really know his story very well. All I knew about my father, for the most part during my upbringing, was the stories that my mother told me. So I had a whole mythology about who he was. Fortunately, the mythology that my mother fed me was a very positive image. So I write about the fact that in the book, I grew up with an image of a strong black man who just didn't happen to be in the house, but was one of the smartest and most charismatic and brightest and honest people that you would ever care to meet. And so that was a mythology that I carried with me despite his absence and despite living in a very different world than his. And it was only later that I started realizing that in fact this was a mythology, that his life was much more complex. And as a consequence of that realization, I've rebelled in all sorts of ways and went through a lot of difficulties that are not unique to me. In fact, particularly among African American males, without fathers in the house, buffeted by a series of negative stereotypes that they see, or at least confining stereotypes of what it means to be a black man in America, that as a consequence of those things, I went in a whole negative direction that lasted throughout most of my teenage years. And what the book discusses then is how did I pull myself out of it, and it ended up being a matter of me recognizing that the struggles that I was going through internally to reconcile a divided heritage, to reconcile the different strands of my past, could only be done if I linked my story up with a larger story. The story of struggle taking place here in the United States with African Americans, the struggle that's taking place overseas with the millions of people who are impoverished and don't have opportunity. And that's part of what led me directly into the community organizing work that I did, the civil rights work that I did, and ultimately into the politics that I'm still engaged in. And so, in some ways, the themes of this book are very much the project of my life right now, which is to figure out how, in fact, can we live together as one people effectively. And what does that mean, and what does that require, and what are the nature of our commitments to each other, and what's the scope of our regard and concern.
What did you hear?
Well, I think you hear in that excerpt part of what he's talking about the book, some of the struggles he went through as a youth. And again, you know, I think one of the things that shows that Obama is not, that he wrote from the position now of being a kind of media star. And at the time, the book was very well reviewed. It was well thought of. It just didn't have a kind of mass appeal and a kind of celebrity figure that gets you on the bestseller list.
Dreams from My Father, The Audacity of Hope. Which, in your view, is the most important book to read if you only read one?
I think The Audacity of Hope is in some ways the book to read. Dreams from My Father is probably the better book, the more literary book, the better written book in many ways, and it reveals more about his early youth and sort of his guiding influences. So in terms of literary merit, Dreams from My Father is the better book. But I think The Audacity of Hope is noteworthy because in the genre of books written by politicians, it's a very, I think, very thoughtful and insightful book. It doesn't have all the usual platitudes that you get from a lot of political books. And it's also noteworthy because he wrote it on his own, and that's something you don't usually see in a lot of political books, of somebody writing their own books. Usually it's with a co-author or a ghostwriter.
No co-author, no ghostwriter for these two books?
No, he wrote both of them on his own. I mean, of course, there are editors at the publishing houses who work with any author, but these were books that he wrote himself, and I think that, to me, of course, as a writer, that's a powerful statement that the best qualification for president is to be a writer. But other people don't necessarily have that attitude.
How would you describe his writing style? And you are a supporter of his.
Yes. And I think his writing style, well, it varies from the two books. Obviously, the Dreams from My Father is much more of a literary book. It's much more in the genre of the memoir. It's very personal, and it reveals how much he reveals about himself. He reveals lots of things that a potential politician would not want to reveal about drug use, about the problems of his and the flaws of his father, as well as his own experiences in his youth. I think his writing style, particularly in The Audacity of Hope, is a very clear, compelling style. It gets to the issues, but it also has, again, his personal experiences. He's able to bring himself in ways that I don't think are trite or very common in these kind of books.
Do you see a difference after he became a senator or a well-known politician in the writing style between the two books?
Well, I think certainly The Audacity of Hope is written a little more carefully with an eye to, I don't want to do anything to embarrass myself or really take any deeply controversial stands. I think that's true of any politician, whereas Dreams from My Father was something written before he went into politics, before he had that kind of political career, before I think he was really thinking about those kinds of things.
202 is our area code, 737-0001 if you live in the East and Central time zones, 202-737-0002 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. We'll begin taking your calls in just a minute, but first we wanted to show you, we covered, Book TV covered Barack Obama in 2000, we covered him when he was on book tour for Dreams from My Father. Here he was talking about the book.
What this book is about is a boy who's growing up and doesn't have a father around.
Not an elitist in the sense he doesn't come from a privileged background like so many politicians do. He's gone through these kind of struggles as a youth that he's had to deal with all these kinds of issues, partly stemming from his father's absence. And it really was for him a choice that he could have chosen this really rebellious outlet, this way of giving up on kind of the American dream and on American society and going down to the roots of cynicism and worse. But he instead went the opposite way, that instead this kind of background, I think, made him someone who was very hopeful, who had a very optimistic outlook.
Well, I want to read two quotes from Dreams from My Father to you and get your response. I learned to slip back and forth between my black and white worlds, understanding that each possessed its own language and customs and structures of meaning, convinced that with a bit of translation on my part, the two worlds would eventually cohere. Junkie, pothead, that's where I'd been headed, the final fatal role of the young would-be black man. Except the highs hadn't been about that, me trying to prove what a down brother I was. Not by then anyway. I got high for just the opposite effect, something that could push questions of who I was out of my mind, something that could flatten out the landscapes of my heart, blur the edges of my memory.
Well, and I think he's talking, and that's sort of his background as an African American, having to exist in these two worlds, which he's had to do his whole life, of being an African American, but also working within this white world, whether it's the white world of the University of Chicago or of elite colleges or Chicago city politics or Illinois state politics or the U.S. Senate, that he has to function within this predominantly white world, as well as the world he's very familiar with from his mother, his grandparents. And yet at the same time, the world looks at him as an African American. He is black, and he connects with that world. And for him, it's really about bridging those two worlds. I think that's been what he's been able to do both personally as well as politically. When, in your view, did he reconcile those two worlds? Well, I think one of the ways that he tried to reconcile those two worlds was when he became a community organizer in Chicago after college in his early 20s. And I think it was his way of going from these elite white worlds of, say, Columbia University and not going into the traditional world he could have gone to, becoming the corporate world, going into these kind of approaches. Instead, he goes to the black community on the south side of Chicago, and he tries to work with them. And what he's really doing with them is connecting the black community with the white political establishment in Chicago, trying to find ways of bringing them together, doing this community organizing so that these black people will have a voice in this white world of politics.
John K. Wilson is our guest. Here's his biography of Barack Obama. This Improbable Quest is the name of the book. And we are talking about Barack Obama's two bestsellers, Dreams from My Father, first out in 1995, reissued in 2004, and Audacity of Hope, 2006 issue. Middletown, Maryland, you are first up. Go ahead with your question for our guest.
Hi, I'd like to ask to your guest about...
The next 3 hours is your chance to participate in a discussion about the books written by the presidential nominees. Joining us are John K. Wilson, author of Barack Obama, This Improbable Quest, and Jonathan Karp, editor of all of John McCain's books.
John Wilson, when did you first meet Barack Obama?
I first met Barack Obama in the mid-1990s when I took a class at the University of Chicago Law School with him on race, racism, and the law. And at the time, I thought, you know, here's somebody who's very knowledgeable, very thoughtful, who listens well, who seems very sensible, and of course I never imagined he could possibly have a political career. And so I think he's somebody who's really surprised me and surprised a lot of people. No one, I think, has ever doubted his intelligence and his abilities, but politics is a very different sport from teaching law or being a thinker, and so it's really remarkable that he's been able to translate so much of, I think, his intelligence and his ideas into the political realm.
What was he like as a teacher?
Well, he was somebody who and other people have commented on this as well in various news reports about him as a teacher. He's somebody who's very willing to listen to people with different points of view. He wasn't an ideologue spouting his ideas at the front of the lectern. He was somebody who was trying to engage students in a conversation, to get them thinking, to get them to challenge their own ideas as well as his ideas.
And in fact, you've written a biography of Barack Obama, This Improbable Quest. Here's the cover of the book. Did he cooperate in your writing of this book?
Well, you didn't cooperate in the sense that I didn't do an interview with him, but it was not meant to be so much of a personal biography, because of course his own autobiographical books tell so much of his own story better than anyone else could. It was meant to be more of a political analysis of his past, of his record, as well as the political environment in which he acts, about this movement that he's created, what I call Generation Obama, of young people who are inspired by his message, as well as all of the attacks he gets from the media, from the right wing as well as the left wing.
Well, this would probably be a good time to explain what we're doing this month on In Depth. We're doing something a little different. We are looking at the books written by Barack Obama and John McCain and trying to see what we can glean from them to learn about their policies and their personalities. John Wilson is a biographer of Barack Obama, former student of his. He'll be our guest for the first hour and a half, and then Jonathan Karp, who's been John McCain's editor, will join us for the second to talk about John McCain's books. Both, and we're going to put the numbers up on the screen in just a minute if you want to participate in this conversation. Both senators, best-selling authors. Would Barack Obama's book, Dreams of My Father, when it was first released in 1995, I believe, how did it sell?
It sold moderately well, maybe 10 or 20,000 copies sold. Nothing extraordinary, nothing special. It really was only when he became a prominent national figure in 2004 after the Democratic National Convention that there was all of this interest in who he was and about his experiences.
And it was re-released then?
Yes, it was re-released, and the copy that's most commonly available has an added preface to the book that